Hey everyone! Welcome back to Supreme Harry. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Harry found a magical guardian clause in the Potter will and got Vernon Dursley arrested? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The compartment. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, measured exactly 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. Harry Potter knew this because he had counted the floorboards enough times that the number had stopped feeling like a number and started feeling like a wall. 14 boards across. 11 down. The crack in the third board from the left made a sound like a knuckle popping when the house settled at night, which it did, reliably, at around 2 in the morning. Harry had learned to use it like a clock. He was 8 years old, and he was very good at noticing things. Tonight the house had gone quiet an hour ago, the particular quality of quiet that meant the Dursleys were properly asleep rather than just watching television in the dark, which Aunt Petunia sometimes did when she was anxious about something. Harry had learned the difference. The television quiet had a faint blue edge to it that crept under the cupboard door. The real quiet was complete. Absolute. The kind that pressed against your eardrums. He sat up carefully, keeping his weight on the balls of his feet so the camp bed springs wouldn't squeal, and pressed his ear to the door. Nothing. The crack in the third board went pop. 2 in the morning. Harry eased the cupboard latch up with 2 fingers. He'd found that lifting slightly while pushing prevented the click, and slipped out into the hallway. He wasn't running away. He'd thought about it. The thinking had been useful in that it had eventually led him to the conclusion that he had nowhere to run to, no money, no warm clothes that actually fit, and no idea what happened to boys who were found wandering the streets at night with bruises on their arms. Aunt Petunia had made very clear, on several separate occasions, that social services would put him somewhere much worse than this, and while Harry suspected she was lying, he didn't quite know enough to be certain. So he wasn't running. He was just moving. Some nights, when the cupboard got to feeling less like a room and more like a box someone had nailed shut, he needed to walk through the house and remind himself that the world was bigger than 14 by 11. He'd gotten very good at moving without sound. The hallway was dark, lamp off, Dudley's latest attempt at drawing pinned crookedly above the radiator. Harry passed it without looking. He passed the coat rack with Vernon's enormous jackets, passed the telephone table, turned left at the kitchen. He stopped. The kitchen light was on. Not the overhead, the small one above the stove, the one Aunt Petunia left on sometimes when she forgot. But it threw enough light through the gap in the door to turn the hallway a soft amber color, and it meant Harry needed to be more careful. He took 2 steps back, pressing himself against the wall, and listened. No sound from the kitchen. No movement. She just left it on. He breathed out. Which was when he noticed the study door. It was open. Not much, just a few inches, which was 3 inches further than it ever was. Vernon kept it locked. Always. Not just when he was in it, but constantly, emphatically, with a key he kept on a separate ring from his car keys because he was, in Harry's private assessment, a very paranoid man. The study was where Vernon kept his work papers and his collection of commemorative golf memorabilia and whatever else he considered important enough to lock away from an 8-year-old boy with no money and nowhere to go. Harry looked at the open door for a moment. Then he walked toward it, because he was 8 years old and he had been locked in a cupboard for 4 days following an incident in which Dudley had actually broken the glass in a school display case and Harry had gotten the blame, and something in him, some stubborn, quiet, unbreakable part that the Dursleys had been trying to reach for years, said why not. The study smelled of old paper and Vernon's cologne and something else, something underneath those things that Harry couldn't name yet, a deep, electric smell, like the air before a thunderstorm. He'd smelled it before, occasionally, at odd moments. When he'd accidentally turned his teacher's hair blue without touching it. When he'd somehow ended up on the school roof after Dudley's gang had cornered him in the playground. It was a smell that seemed to come from inside his own chest rather than outside, which was confusing, and so he'd learned to ignore it. It was stronger here. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. The desk with its neat stack of folders. The cabinet with its golf trophies. The bookshelves with their bound copies of Smelting's alumni directories and automotive manuals. Everything in its place, everything squared off at right angles, everything, he frowned. The bookshelf on the right wall was fractionally different. He couldn't have said exactly how he knew this. The books looked the same. The gap where Vernon kept his dictionary was the same gap. But the shelf itself sat maybe a half-inch further from the wall than it should have, and the skirting board below it had a faint pale line along its top edge, like something had scraped against it recently. Harry crossed the room. The thunderstorm smell hit him like walking into a warm room from the cold, sudden and total and almost dizzying. His hand moved before he made a decision to move it. He pressed his palm flat against the side of the bookshelf and something, not a sound, not exactly, more like a vibration that lived below sound, below hearing, in the bones of his hand and up through his wrist and into his chest, responded to his touch. The shelf swung inward. Not dramatically, not like something in a film. It just opened, quietly, on what turned out to be very well-maintained hinges, revealing a space about the size of, well, about the size of Harry's cupboard, which was a comparison that landed with a specific kind of weight. The compartment inside was empty except for a single wooden box, roughly the size of a large shoebox, sitting on the floor. The box was dark wood with a grain like rippled water, and it was sealed with a clasp that had no keyhole. Just a flat, circular disc of something that might have been wax or might have been glass, engraved with a symbol Harry didn't recognize, an overlapping P worked into a design that looked like a bird in flight. He crouched down and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. He turned the clasp over, examining it. No hinge mechanism he could see, no obvious way to open it. He pressed the disc, nothing happened. He turned the box over, smooth bottom, no markings. He held it up and looked at the underside of the clasp in the light coming from the desk lamp he'd switched on, because at this point he was committed, and noticed that the engraved bird's eye was slightly recessed. Like a button that needed a very specific kind of pressure. He pressed his thumb to it. The thunderstorm smell became a crack of lightning. The disc flared, not brightly, just a warm amber pulse, exactly the color of the kitchen light through the door, gone as quickly as it came, and the clasp fell open. Harry sat down on the floor because his legs felt strange and opened the box. Inside, laid flat on a lining of deep green material that had kept them pristine, were documents. Not like Aunt Petunia's documents in her filing cabinet, not tax returns and utility bills and Dudley's school reports. These were different. The paper was heavy, almost cloth-like, and when Harry lifted the top sheet he could see that the ink was very dark, very precise, and absolutely, unmistakably not produced by any typewriter or printer he'd ever seen. It moved. Not much. Not dramatically. The ink at the margins shifted and resettled like it was adjusting to being exposed to light, and the letters in the header grew fractionally bolder as he held the paper, as though they were asserting themselves. Last will and testament of James Charles Potter and Lily Jane Potter, née Evans, witnessed and sealed by the Gringotts Bank of England, London, registered with the Wizarding Probate Office, Ministry of Magic, October 31, 1981. Harry sat very still. He read it twice. He wasn't a fast reader, the Dursleys hadn't been particularly invested in his education, and his primary school was the kind of institution where the teachers were too overwhelmed to notice which kids were slipping through the gaps, but he was a careful one. He read slowly, and he understood more than he expected to, and by the time he reached the bottom of the first page his hands had developed a very slight tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. James and Lily Potter. His parents. He knew almost nothing about them. What he knew, they had died in a car crash. His father had been unemployed and a drunk. His mother had been, Aunt Petunia's version of his mother had always stopped somewhere short of actually describing a person, had always been this vague shape of something shameful. He'd built up a composite from the absence of information, the same way you could tell the shape of a hole from the dirt around its edge. The will described different people entirely. James Charles Potter, it said, was the last scion of the ancient and noble house of Potter, holder of a seat on the Wizarding Governance Council, and a member of an organization called the Order of the Phoenix. Lily Jane Potter was described as one of the most gifted spellcrafters of her generation, a Muggle-born witch whose research into protective enchantments had been considered groundbreaking. They hadn't died in a car crash. Harry sat with that fact for a moment. He held it at arm's length, looked at it, and then, deliberately, set it aside to look at later. Because the document in his hands wasn't finished, and the smell in the room was still crackling, and there was something underneath the will, a second document, shorter, bound with a different clasp, this one with his name on it in the same shifting ink. For Harry James Potter, TOB opened in case of activation. He opened it. Guardian Clause, Potter Family Instrument drafted by James Charles Potter, October 23, 1981. This document constitutes a binding instrument under both Goblin Contract Law and Wizarding Probate Statute 7, Section 12. In the event that the primary guardian named in the last will and testament of James and Lily Potter is found to have failed in their duty of care, whether through deliberate harm, willful neglect, or conduct unbecoming of a guardian, this clause is to be activated by the blood of the ward upon this document. Upon activation, the following provisions apply immediately and without exception. First, the Gringotts account office is to be notified of activation via the monitoring seal embedded in this document. Second, the secondary guardian, named below, is to be located and assessed for guardianship. Third, all assets of the Potter estate, currently held in trust, are to be formally reviewed. Fourth, any party found to have knowingly placed or kept the ward in a harmful environment is subject to review under Wizarding family law. Harry read that last line again. Any party found to have knowingly placed or kept the ward in a harmful environment. He looked at the words monitoring seal. Then he looked at his thumb, the one he'd pressed to the clasp. There was a small mark on the pad of it, not a cut exactly, just a raised line, pale pink, barely there. He touched it to the document. The parchment went warm under his hand. The ink at the bottom of the page pulsed once, twice, that amber color again, and then went very bright for one sharp second before settling. In the silence of Vernon Dursley's study, at 2 in the morning, something old and patient and very, very powerful woke up and sent a message. Harry sat on the floor holding the documents against his chest and breathed. After a while he read the rest. The secondary guardian named in the Guardian Clause was someone called Sirius Orion Black, listed as godfather and bloodsworn guardian, primary confidant of James Potter, trusted above all others with the care and protection of Harry James Potter. There was a note in James's handwriting, actually his handwriting, different from the formal type of the document, loose and slightly slanted, the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly because his thoughts moved faster than his pen, that said, Padfoot, if you're reading this because Harry is, then something has gone very wrong and I'm sorry. You know what to do. You always did, even when you pretended not to. Look after him. He's everything. Harry read those last 3 words 4 times. Then he put the documents back in the box, tucked the box under his arm, and walked back to his cupboard. He lay down on the camp bed, stared at the ceiling, the crack above his head that had always looked faintly like a lightning bolt if you tilted your head, and waited. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. The document had said Gringotts would be notified. He didn't know what Gringotts was. He didn't know what any of the institutions named in the document were. He didn't know who Sirius Black was except what 12 lines of formal text had told him. But he wasn't afraid. That was the strange part. He felt, if anything, very calm, the specific calm that comes not from the absence of feeling but from the presence of clarity. Things made sense now that hadn't made sense before. The thunderstorm smell. The way the teacher had looked at him after the hair incident, not angry exactly but startled, like she'd seen something she didn't have a category for. The way Aunt Petunia sometimes looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, with something in her face that wasn't quite dislike and wasn't quite fear but sat between the two like a closed door. She'd known. She had to have known. Harry turned onto his side, pulled the thin blanket up, and closed his eyes. Somewhere across the country, in the vaults of Gringotts Bank beneath London, a monitoring seal completed its journey and delivered its message. An account manager named Ragnarok stopped what he was doing, which was reviewing the thoroughly suspicious state of the Potter estate's management over the past 7 years, and read the alert. Then he read it again. Then he set down his quill with the careful deliberateness of someone who is very, very angry and is choosing to express that anger through precision rather than volume. He reached for a fresh piece of parchment and began to write. The knock on the door came at 3 in the morning. Not a polite knock. Not the tentative knock of someone who was aware of the hour and apologetic about it. This was a knock with authority in it, 2 sharp raps that said, "I know you're in there and the hour is entirely irrelevant to me." Harry heard it from his cupboard and sat up immediately. He heard Vernon's bedroom door bang open. Vernon didn't open doors, he displaced them, and the thunder of size 14 feet on the landing, and then on the stairs. "Who the blazes?" Vernon's voice, thick with sleep and outrage, approaching the front door. "It is 3 in the morning, Mr. Vernon Dursley." The voice on the other side of the door was female, cool and precise, and it carried through the wood and the walls and the dark hallway as though volume were entirely optional. "My name is Assessor Miriam Bones, Office of Wizarding Family Law, Ministry of Magic. I am accompanied by an account representative of Gringotts Bank. Please open the door." A long silence. "I'm sorry," Vernon said, in the tone he used when he was buying time, "I think you have we do not have the wrong house, Mr. Dursley. We have the correct address, the correct resident, and a fully activated guardian clause under the name of Harry James Potter, who is currently residing at this property in your care. Please open the door, or I will be required to note your non-compliance in my report, which will be presented to the Wisengamot family court at 9 o'clock this morning." Another silence. The sound of a lock turning. Harry eased his cupboard door open and peered out. Vernon was in the hallway in his dressing gown, which was maroon and monogrammed and hung off him in a way that, objectively, was somewhat undignified. He was very pink. He'd opened the door, and through the gap Harry could see 2 figures, a tall woman in dark robes with close-cropped grey hair and reading glasses on a chain, holding a leather folder, and beside her a figure that was, shorter. Much shorter. With long fingers wrapped around a briefcase and eyes that caught the streetlight like polished amber. A goblin. Harry didn't know the word yet, but he recognized not human with the quick, uncomplicated certainty of a child who hadn't yet learned to perform confusion. "Mr. Dursley," said Assessor Bones, already stepping past him into the hallway as though he'd been invited, "will need somewhere to sit. The kitchen will do." "Now just a moment," Vernon sputtered, and the goblin, Ragnarok, Harry would learn his name shortly, looked up at Vernon with an expression of such elaborate professional neutrality that it was somehow worse than contempt. "I am Ragnarok, Senior Account Manager for the Potter Estate, Gringotts Bank," he said. His voice was precise and dry as autumn leaves. "I have been managing, or attempting to manage, the Potter accounts for approximately 7 years. I have a considerable amount to say. I would prefer to say it seated." He looked around the hallway with an expression of mild distaste, and then his amber eyes found Harry's through the cupboard door. There was a pause. Ragnarok looked at the cupboard door. He looked at its latch. He looked at the fold-up cot visible through the gap, and the single light bulb on a cord, and the coats hung above the head of the bed, and the shelf of Dudley's old broken toys that had been pushed to the far end to make room for a human child to sleep. Something moved through his face that was too precise and too contained to be called rage, but lived in the same neighborhood. "The child," he said, very quietly, "is sleeping under the stairs." It wasn't a question. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It sounded like a sentence being dictated for the record, which was precisely what it was, because Ragnarok's memory was perfect and everything he witnessed from this moment forward would be going into the most comprehensive case file the Gringotts Legal Division had assembled since 1749. Petunia had appeared at the top of the stairs, belting her housecoat. "It's perfectly, Mrs. Dursley," said Assessor Bones, without turning around. "I'd recommend against finishing that sentence without a legal advocate present." The kitchen was large enough for a table that seated 6, which meant there were enough chairs for Vernon and Petunia to sit at one end looking like defendants, and for Bones and Ragnarok to sit at the other looking like everything that title implied, and for Harry to sit in the middle, Ragnar had turned to him at the cupboard door and said, in that same precise, dry tone, "Mr. Potter, would you please join us?" In a way that made it the most formally respectful thing anyone had said to Harry in his entire memory. He joined them. He was sitting now at the kitchen table in his two small pajamas, the wooden box on the table in front of him because he'd brought it on instinct, and apparently that had been the right instinct, because Ragnar had looked at it the moment it appeared and said, "Ah. You have the original," with the faint relief of a man whose job had just gotten measurably easier. Assessor Bones opened her leather folder. She had the air of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and had no remaining patience for dissembling. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. At approximately 2:17 this morning, the guardian clause embedded in the Potter family instrument was activated. This clause was drafted by James Potter in October 1981 and registered with both Gringotts and the Ministry of Magic. Its activation is legally binding and cannot be contested, sealed, or delayed by any party, including members of the Wisengamot or officers of the ministry. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Vernon had gone through several colors of pink and arrived at something approaching puce. I want to know, he said, with the studied outrage of a man who knew he was on thin ground and was hoping volume would disguise this. Who authorized? James Potter authorized it, Ragnar said. In 1981. It has been waiting. Dumbledore, Petunia started. Professor Dumbledore, Bones said, and her voice went fractionally cooler, is not the relevant authority here, Mrs. Dursley, regardless of what you may have been led to believe. He is the headmaster of Hogwarts School, not a legal guardian, not an officer of the ministry, and not a party to the Potter will. He was not consulted in the drafting of the Guardian Clause, and his opinion of its activation is not a consideration. Harry watched his aunt's face do something he'd never seen it do before. The competence she normally wore, that tight, controlled, I know exactly what I'm doing expression, slipped. For just a moment she looked like someone who had been maintaining a very specific story for a very long time and had just been told that the audience knew the ending. Now, said Bones, turning a page in her folder, I need to establish several things for the record, and I need to do so in the presence of Mr. Potter, as he is the ward in question and is entitled to hear everything. She looked at Harry. Is that acceptable to you, Mr. Potter? Harry said, yes, because it was, and because being asked was something. How long have you been residing in the cupboard under the stairs? He thought about lying. Not to protect the Dursleys, that impulse had been trained out of him so thoroughly that it never even knocked on the door anymore. He thought about lying because he had learned, over 8 years, that telling the truth about Privet Drive tended to produce reactions in adults that then produced consequences for him. Teachers who said something to Petunia, who then had something to say to Harry about running his mouth. Neighbors who nodded sympathetically and then looked away because the Dursleys were respectable and Harry was a problem child, everyone said so. But Assessor Bones was not a teacher or a neighbor, and she was not looking at him with pity or skepticism. She was looking at him with the direct, steady attention of someone who was going to write down exactly what he said and then do something about it. Since I was about 1, he said. I don't remember being anywhere else. Bones wrote it down. Ragnar, who had opened his briefcase and removed several folders of his own, made a small sound that was entirely inexpressive but somehow conveyed an enormous amount. Have you ever been taken to a physician? A doctor? No. Have you been enrolled in a school? The local primary. But I started late, Dudley goes on the bus and I had to walk, so I was a year behind for a while. Vernon made a sound. Bones looked at him, and the look was enough, he stopped making the sound. The marks on your arms, Bones said, not looking up from her folder. Both forearms. A healed cut above your left eyebrow. Would you like to tell me about those, or would you prefer to wait until we're somewhere private? Harry looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, I don't mind, which was the truest thing he could say, because he'd found that minding things was an expensive business. Harry. That was Ragnar, and something about the way the goblin said his name, not Mr. Potter now but Harry, careful and deliberate, made Harry look up. Ragnar's amber eyes were entirely level. You should know something. What? Your father's estate was worth, as of October 1981, approximately 470,000 galleons in liquid currency, plus property, investments, and the Potter family library, which alone has an appraised value of approximately 60,000 galleons. He paused, letting that settle, watching Harry's face with the attention of someone who knew what he was about to say mattered. You are not, and have never been, without resources. You have been kept without resources. That is a different thing. The kitchen was very quiet. Harry thought about the two small pajamas. The camp bed with the springs that squealed. The cupboard under the stairs. The birthday that came and went every year without acknowledgement, the Christmas presents that were Dudley's old broken things rewrapped. The food, always enough to function, never enough to feel full. The way Vernon had looked at him every day for 8 years as though his continued existence was a personal affront. He thought about 470,000 galleons. He nodded once, very slowly. Right, he said. I have been trying to contact someone with authority over your case for 6 years, Ragnar continued. The estate has been under a management order since 1981, nominally administered by the Ministry's Department of Magical Orphans. Every inquiry I have made has been redirected, dismissed, or simply left unanswered. The documents you found tonight, the fact that your father placed them in a location accessible only to a Potter by blood, in the home of the Muggle Guardians, rather than in the vault where they might have been, a pause, interfered with, suggests that your father had concerns about the integrity of the process. He thought someone might try to stop it, Harry said. I believe so, yes. Harry looked at the box on the table. At the P worked into the design of the clasp, the bird in flight. He thought about the note in his father's handwriting. He's everything. Who's Sirius Black? He asked. Ragnar and Bones exchanged a look, the kind that had a whole conversation in it. Your godfather, Bones said carefully. Named as secondary guardian in the clause. He is currently, she paused, and something in the pause had weight to it, he is currently held in Azkaban prison. What did he do? Another look exchanged. That, said Ragnar, with the precision of someone setting a charge, is an extremely good question, and one we intend to pursue. The answer, on examination of the available evidence, may be less straightforward than the official record suggests. Vernon had been sitting in rigid, trembling silence for the past several minutes, and the dam broke. None of this, he started, voice pitched to carry, to dominate, to fill the room the way it always had, none of this circus changes the fact that the boy is, the boy, said Assessor Bones, looking up from her folder for the first time since she'd sat down, and the quality of her attention was like a searchlight being turned on, is 8 years old, has been sleeping under your stairs since he was 1, has not seen a doctor, has visible injuries, and has been deliberately kept ignorant of an estate worth nearly 500,000 galleons to which he is the sole heir. She closed her folder. Mr. Dursley. I have a warrant for your formal detainment for questioning, signed by Acting Magistrate Whitmore of the Wizarding Family Court, issued 40 minutes ago when I notified the court of the clause activation. You are not under arrest at this precise moment. You will be if you raise your voice to me again. The kitchen went very quiet again. Dudley had appeared in the doorway, round-faced and confused in his pajamas with the Smelts, the cartoon dog he loved, on the chest. He looked at the adults at the table, and then at Harry, and for a moment, just a moment, his face did something complicated. Harry had never seen that particular expression on Dudley's face before and didn't have a name for it. Petunia got up immediately and steered Dudley away, her voice dropping to murmurs. Vernon sat very still, and for the first time in Harry's life, he looked small. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a collapse. He just sat there in his maroon dressing gown and looked at his hands on the table, and the pink drained out of his face, and what was left underneath was something tired and frightened and, Harry thought, genuinely confused, the confusion of a man who had made a set of decisions that had seemed, to him, correct and justified, and was only now beginning to understand that the rest of the world did not share his assessment. Harry had expected to feel something at that sight. Satisfaction, maybe. Triumph. What he actually felt was mostly tired. "What happens now?" he asked Ragnarok. "Tonight, you will come with us," Ragnarok said. "We have arranged temporary accommodation, the Leaky Cauldron on Charing Cross Road, which is both Muggle accessible and secure. You will have your own room. Tomorrow morning, I will take you to Gringotts and we will begin formally reviewing the estate. Assessor Bones will begin the process with Mr. Dursley." He looked at Harry steadily. "You will not be returning to this house." Harry thought about the cupboard. The camp bed. The crack in the ceiling that looked like a lightning bolt. He thought about 470,000 galleons waiting in a vault under London. "Can I get my things?" he asked. Of course. He had very few things. That was the work of 10 minutes. A box of nondescript second-hand clothes, mostly Dudley's hand-me-downs, 2 school exercise books, a pencil case, a marble he'd found in the playground that was very nicely blue. He stood in the cupboard and looked at the shelf of Dudley's broken toys and the crack in the ceiling and the 14 by 11 boards, and he thought about whether he was supposed to feel something more. He felt the beginning of something that might, if it had room to grow, eventually become relief. He picked up his box and walked out of the cupboard for the last time, pulling the door shut behind him with a clean, final click. Ragnarok was waiting in the hallway. He looked at Harry's box of belongings, the smallness of it, the shabbiness, and then he looked up at Harry with that same precise, level gaze. "Mr. Potter," he said. "I want to say something to you that is not part of my official capacity as your account manager, and which I would not ordinarily say to a client." Harry waited. "What was done to you here was wrong," Ragnarok said. "Not unfortunate. Not a mistake. Wrong. And the people responsible, all of them, will be held accountable. You have my word as a goblin, and that is not a thing we give lightly." Harry looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He meant it. Outside, the street was dark and empty, the suburban silence of 3 in the morning sitting over Privet Drive like a held breath. The same tidy houses with their same tidy gardens, the same lampposts, the same row of cars. Harry walked down the front path and didn't look back. Behind him, through the kitchen window, he could hear Assessor Bones reading Vernon Dursley the formal detainment notice in that cool, precise voice, and Vernon saying something, and Bones saying something back, and the particular sound of a man running out of bluster. Ragnarok walked beside Harry to the dark car waiting at the curb, not a ministry vehicle, a Gringotts one, which was noticeably cleaner and more efficient, and opened the rear door with the kind of courtesy that had nothing to do with servitude and everything to do with respect. Harry got in. The car pulled away from number 4, Privet Drive, and Harry James Potter watched it recede through the back window, the lit kitchen, the tidy garden, the cupboard under the stairs, and then turned around and looked forward at the dark road ahead and the first grey suggestion of London's light on the horizon. His parents hadn't died in a car crash. He had a godfather. He had an estate worth 470,000 galleons. And something old and patient and deeply tied to the smell of thunderstorms, had woken up when his blood touched that parchment, and it wasn't going back to sleep. The car drove on through the dark, and Harry sat quietly in the back seat with his box of belongings on his lap, and waited to find out what happened next. Chapter 2, The Reckoning. The leaky cauldron smelled like wood smoke and something fermented and old, and Harry loved it immediately. He couldn't have explained why, exactly. It was dim and slightly crooked, and the barman, a man called Tom who had so many wrinkles that his face looked like it had been folded and refolded many times, looked at Harry when Ragnarok let him through the door at 3:15 in the morning and went very still in the way that people sometimes did around Harry, that startled stillness, before recovering himself with visible effort. "Mr. Potter," Tom said, and his voice was warm and a little unsteady. It's very good to have you, sir." "Very good indeed." "Thanks," Harry said, because it seemed like the right response. His room was on the second floor, up a staircase that leaned slightly to the left, with a window that looked out over the dark tangle of what would turn out to be Diagon Alley and a bed, a real bed, wide and solid, with actual pillows, that Harry sat down on and then had to sit on for a moment, simply absorbing the fact of it. Ragnarok stood in the doorway and said, "There is food in the sitting room downstairs if you're hungry. Tom will bring anything you want. Sleep if you can. We have a full day tomorrow, but nothing begins before you're ready." Harry said, "What time should I be ready?" Ragnarok seemed to consider this. 9. "But if you need 10, that is also acceptable. 9's fine." After Ragnarok left, Harry ate 3 bread rolls with butter and a bowl of soup that Tom brought up without being asked, apparently on instinct, and then he lay down in the actual bed and looked at the actual ceiling, plaster, with a pattern of overlapping diamonds, no crack, no lightning bolt, and slept for 5.5 hours without moving. He dreamed of nothing. Gringotts Bank was a white building that stabbed upward out of Diagon Alley like a declaration. Harry walked through its bronze doors behind Ragnarok at 9:15 the next morning. He'd woken at 8, eaten a full breakfast, and was still working out what to do with the feeling of not being watched while he ate, and the interior hit him like cold water. The scale of it. The marble columns and the hundreds of goblins at their stations along the counters, each one absorbed in something that looked tremendously important. The distant sound of things moving deep underground, mechanical and rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the rock. The smell of metal and stone and something ancient that Harry couldn't name but recognized, distantly, as being in the same family as the thunderstorm smell. Several goblins looked up as he passed. Not in the startle and recover way Tom had done, but with a different quality of attention, assessing, precise, like surveyors marking a boundary. Ragnarok led him past the main counters, through a side door, and into a corridor that was considerably warmer and better lit than the public hall, with doors on either side and the sound of voices and shuffling paper. Ragnarok's office was at the end, a room lined with filing cabinets and stacked ledgers, with a desk so covered in papers that only a small central clearing remained, just enough space for 2 cups of tea and a folder, which Harry suspected was not an accident. "Sit," said Ragnarok, already moving behind his desk. "Tea?" "Yes please." The tea was already there. Harry sat in the chair across from Ragnarok, a proper chair, not a 3-legged stool or a folding thing, a real chair with arms, and watched Ragnarok open the central folder with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting to open it for years. "I want to explain several things," Ragnarok said. "I want to explain them clearly and completely, because you are entitled to understand the full situation. Some of it will be difficult to hear. Do you have questions before I begin?" Harry thought about it. "You said last night that you'd been trying to contact someone about my case for 6 years. Who were you trying to contact?" "The Ministry's Department of Magical Orphans, which had nominal oversight of your estate." "And," a fractional pause, "Albus Dumbledore, who placed you with the Dursleys and communicated to the department that the arrangement was satisfactory and required no further oversight." "So he knew." "He knew you were placed there, yes. Whether he knew the specific conditions," Ragnarok's pause was careful, measured, "is something that will need to be established." Harry nodded slowly. "Okay. Tell me the rest." So Ragnarok told him. The Potter estate was, in full, worth considerably more than 470,000 galleons. That figure had been the liquid currency alone in 1981. With interest, investments, property holdings, and the contents of several secondary vaults that had not been properly catalogued since James Potter's death, the actual total was closer to 3 million. There were 2 properties, one in Godric's Hollow, which had been destroyed, and one in Shropshire that no one outside Gringotts and the Potter family line knew existed, sealed under a fidelius charm with James Potter as his own secret keeper, meaning the secret had died with him and the property had simply vanished from all records. It was still there, physically intact, waiting for the correct heir to locate it. "How do I find a place that nobody knows exists?" Harry asked. "The charm is unusual in that James Potter created a secondary access condition," Ragnarok said. "If the primary heir activates the guardian clause, as you have done, the fidelius partially dissolves. You would be able to find it. In time." Harry filed that away. The estate had been under a management order since 1981, technically administered by the ministry but in practice largely untouched. Money had been accumulating in the vaults. No one had invested it on Harry's behalf, no educational trusts had been established, nothing had been done that a competent magical guardian would normally do. It had simply sat there, which, Ragnarok said with the careful neutrality of someone choosing not to say this was deliberate, was not standard practice for an estate of this size. Dumbledore had the authority to direct the ministry's management, Ragnarok said. He chose not to engage with it. Because if I'd known about the money, Harry said slowly, working it out as he spoke, I might have asked questions. Or someone might have asked them for me. Ragnarok looked at him for a moment. You're 8 years old. I know. You reasoned that out in approximately 10 seconds. Was I wrong? Ragnarok said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The other thing Ragnarok needed to discuss was the matter of Sirius Black. He laid the relevant documents out on the cleared space in the center of his desk, Harry's copy from the box and Gringotts' own files, and walked through them with the same precise efficiency he brought to everything. Sirius Orion Black. Aged 31. Imprisoned in Azkaban in November 1981 on charges of betraying the Potters to Voldemort and murdering 13 people, 12 Muggles and 1 wizard, Peter Pettigrew, in a street in London the day after the attack on Godric's Hollow. Harry listened to this without moving. He was convicted by the Wisengamot, he asked. He was not tried by the Wisengamot, Ragnarok said. The words sat in the room for a moment. He wasn't, what? There was no trial. In the immediate aftermath of the Voldemort incident, and it was an incident, Mr. Potter, the wizarding world was in a state of profound disarray. Sirius Black was taken into custody and placed in Azkaban without a formal hearing, without the presentation of evidence, and without representation. Ragnarok's voice remained entirely level. This was technically illegal under wizarding law at the time, which requires a formal hearing for all capital offenses within 30 days of imprisonment. The hearing never occurred. Harry stared at him. So he might be innocent. The evidence supporting the official account is, on examination, not as solid as it was presented to be. Pettigrew was the Potter's secret keeper, not Black. This is documented in James Potter's own notes, held here at Gringotts. If Pettigrew was the betrayer, then Black was in pursuit of him, not the other way around. And the 13 bodies, Ragnarok turned a page, the forensic report at the time noted anomalies that were not pursued. An explosion of that magnitude from a single wand is unusual. The absence of Pettigrew's body, only a finger was recovered, was recorded and then, apparently, dismissed. Harry thought about the note in the box. Padfoot, if you're reading this because Harry is, then something has gone very wrong and I'm sorry. You know what to do. Padfoot. Sirius Black had a nickname. His father had given it to him. His father had trusted him above everyone. He's been in there for 7 years, Harry said. Without a trial. Yes. We need to get him out. Ragnarok looked at him with that level, assessing gaze. Assessor Bones is already examining the legal grounds. The Guardian Clause naming him as secondary guardian provides a mechanism. His guardianship status requires formal review, which requires him to be accessible for assessment, which requires him not to be in Azkaban. Essentially. It's not simple. Azkaban is administered by the Dementor population under Ministry authority, and the Ministry will not be enthusiastic. Who do we need to convince? That, said Ragnarok, is going to depend on how the next several hours go. The knock on the door of Ragnarok's office came at 11:30, and it was nothing like the knock on the Dursleys' door at 3 in the morning. This one was precise, measured, the knock of someone who was entirely confident of their welcome and expressing that confidence through the quality of their knuckle contact. The door opened before Ragnarok said anything, and Albus Dumbledore came in. Harry had never seen him before, and the impression was immediate and complicated. Tall, very tall, with the kind of height that folded slightly at the shoulders, like a building that had learned to be apologetic about its own scale. A long silver beard. Half-moon spectacles. Robes that were technically purple but so elaborately embroidered that they registered as an event rather than a color. Blue eyes, behind the glasses, that were warm and sharp at the same time in a way that Harry associated with teachers who were very good at seeming kind while not necessarily being kind. He looked at Harry, and his expression did something quick and complex, surprise, relief, something that might have been guilt, all of it smoothed over in an instant with something warmer and more practiced. "Harry," he said. "My dear boy." "Professor Dumbledore," said Ragnarok, and his voice had acquired a quality that Harry would come to think of as his formal hostility register, perfectly polite, deeply antagonistic. "You were not invited to this meeting." "No," Dumbledore agreed, settling into the chair beside Harry's as though he'd been offered it. "But I heard what happened last night, and I felt it important to. How did you hear?" Harry asked. Dumbledore looked at him with those warm, sharp eyes. "I beg your pardon. You heard what happened last night." "How?" Harry kept his voice conversational, genuinely curious. "It was 3 in the morning. Ragnarok said the clause activated at 2:17. By the time Assessor Bones finished at Privet Drive and we came here, it was past 4. So when did you hear, and who told you?" A brief pause. The warmth in Dumbledore's eyes adjusted slightly, recalibrated, like a calculation being revised. "I have sources," he said. "I keep apprised of certain situations." "You have someone watching me," Harry said. "Even though I didn't know about any of this. Even though you never contacted me, never checked on me, never," he kept his voice even, "sent anyone to verify that things were acceptable. But you have someone watching, and they told you when the clause activated." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The silence had a texture to it, the silence of a man who was used to controlling conversations and had just realized this one had left him flat-footed before it properly started. "Harry," he said gently, "I understand that last night must have been confusing and overwhelming. And I want you to know that everything I did, every decision I made on your behalf, was made with your best interests at heart." "Were they made with his knowledge?" Ragnarok asked. "He was 1 year old, he is 8 years old now," Ragnarok said. "And has been capable of receiving information for several years. Years during which no one from your office or the ministry contacted him, educated him about his situation, or verified his welfare. Years during which his inquiries," Ragnarok opened a specific folder, a thin one, and slid it across the desk, "I say his inquiries, though of course he was unaware of the estate's existence. The inquiries I am referring to are those made on his behalf by his primary school, who noted in their records the child's unusual home circumstances and contacted the local authority on 2 separate occasions. Both times the matter was resolved quickly, the school was reassured, and the case was closed." Dumbledore looked at the folder. "I was not aware. The resolutions came from a ministry staffer in the Department of Magical Orphans who has since left that position. Her correspondence during that period shows contact with your office." The room was very quiet. Harry watched Dumbledore's face. The man was good, he was remarkably good, his expression moving through something that looked genuinely like shock and concern, but something in the calculation of it, the speed of the recovery, made Harry think of Vernon. Not the same kind of man, not remotely, but the same mechanism, a person who had a story about themselves and was extremely committed to it. "I want to be very clear about something," Harry said. He kept his voice level, conversational, without heat. "I'm not angry." This was true, or mostly true, the anger was there, but it was a cold, patient thing rather than a hot one, and it wasn't getting in the way. "I'm not going to shout or cry or do whatever you came here expecting me to do. But I need you to understand that I've read the clause, and I've spoken with Ragnarok, and I know what my rights are. And what I'd like to know from you is this: where is Sirius Black, and what do you actually know about why he's in Azkaban?" Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not the surface warmth, but underneath it, something that looked almost like reassessment. "Sirius Black is a dangerous man," he said. I know that's not what the document says, but, he didn't get a trial, Harry said. The evidence at the time, Ragnarok tells me Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper. That's in my father's notes, which have been sitting in a Gringotts vault for 7 years. Did you know that? The pause was a fraction of a second too long. I had concerns, Dumbledore said carefully. About Sirius. About his state of mind, in the aftermath. Did you know Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper? Dumbledore took off his half-moon glasses and held them in both hands, a gesture that, Harry sensed, was designed to signal thoughtful gravity. The question of what I knew and when is, it's a yes or no question, Harry said, and his voice was still perfectly even, perfectly calm. I'm 8. I know what yes and no mean. Ragnarok made a sound that in a less controlled individual would have been a laugh. Dumbledore put his glasses back on. He looked at Harry with those blue eyes, and this time the warmth was still there but the sharpness was more visible, less covered. He'd stopped, Harry thought, performing quite so hard. You are remarkably composed, he said. For someone who has just had their world completely inverted. My world was a cupboard under some stairs, Harry said. Inversions are relative. Another silence. What is it that you want, Harry? I want my godfather out of Azkaban, Harry said. I want to understand what actually happened to my parents. I want the estate properly managed. And I want to know, he looked at Dumbledore steadily, why you put me there. In that house. With those people. When there was a guardian clause. When there was Sirius. When there was clearly another option. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Outside Ragnarok's office, the sounds of the bank continued, the distant rhythmic thudding from the mines below, the murmur of voices, the scratch of quills. The ordinary sounds of a place that had been functioning since before anyone in this room was born and would continue functioning long after. The blood wards, Dumbledore said finally. Your mother's sacrifice created a protection tied to her bloodline. By placing you with Petunia, her sister, I anchored that protection. As long as you called that house home, Voldemort's followers could not find you. Voldemort, Harry said. Yes. Who is? Harry stopped. Because he knew this name, actually, from the documents in the box. It hadn't quite landed when he'd read it, surrounded by everything else, but it was there, a name referred to obliquely in his parents' will, in the context of the Order of the Phoenix, in the context of why a guardian clause had been necessary in the first place. He's the one who killed my parents. Yes. And he's gone now. Someone said, after the thing at Godric's Hollow, he is gone, Dumbledore said. Yes. Destroyed, we believe, by the magical protection your mother placed on you. His body is gone, his power is gone. He is not a current threat. Then the blood ward protection, 7 years of it, was for a threat that no longer existed? Dumbledore's expression didn't change. But something around the edges of him shifted, slightly, like a very large ship making a very small correction. We could not be certain, but you could have checked, Harry said. You could have verified. You could have done anything in 7 years to determine whether the original justification for the arrangement was still necessary. And instead he stopped, and then said the thing he'd been working his way toward since the moment Dumbledore had walked in and said my dear boy in that particular voice, and instead you checked that I was contained. Not safe. Contained. The word sat in the room. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, you are very much your father's son. Good, Harry said. Assessor Bones arrived at Gringotts at noon with a folder under one arm and the look of someone who had been awake for the better part of 20 hours and was running on professional momentum and sheer stubbornness. Dumbledore had left an hour earlier, after Ragnarok had informed him, with precise courtesy, that as Harry's account manager he was asking all non-essential parties to vacate his office, and that if Dumbledore wished to make a formal statement regarding his involvement with the Potter guardianship arrangement he could do so in writing to the Wizarding Family Court. Dumbledore had stood, and looked at Harry once more, and said, I hope you'll let me explain more fully, in time. Harry had said, I hope so too, which was true in a way that was also a warning, and Dumbledore had left with the careful bearing of a man who knew the conversation was not finished. Bones sat down in the chair Dumbledore had vacated and opened her folder on Ragnarok's desk without preamble. Vernon Dursley is in ministry custody, she said. He's being held at the Cooperation Facility on Whitehall. It's a joint facility we use for cases involving both Muggle and Wizarding law. His wife has a solicitor from the Muggle side and has been formally cautioned. The boy, Dudley, is with Petunia's mother, who apparently lives in Bath and is either very confused or very good at pretending to be. Harry looked up. What's going to happen to them? Bones looked at him. To Vernon Dursley, specifically? That depends on the testimony. The physical evidence, the injuries catalogued last night, is solid. The school records. The documentation from the primary school's 2 welfare reports that were subsequently buried. She paused. In Wizarding Family Court, the case is straightforward. In Muggle terms, it will require a referral to the appropriate authority, which we're coordinating with now. He will almost certainly face charges on both sides. Harry nodded slowly. You'll need to testify, Bones said. In the Wizarding Court, for certain. Possibly in the Muggle one as well. Are you willing to do that? Yes, Harry said, without hesitating. Bones looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite softness. She didn't seem like someone who did softness easily, but was something adjacent to it. Something that recognized what he'd just said and what it cost, and respected both. Good. We'll prepare you thoroughly. You won't go in without knowing exactly what to expect. She turned back to her folder. Now. Sirius Black. Tell me, Harry said. The case for wrongful imprisonment is, she paused, choosing her words, stronger than I expected when I first pulled the file last night. Much stronger. The absence of a trial is the cornerstone. Beyond that, there are 3 pieces of evidence that weren't properly examined in 1981. She counted them off. First, James Potter's own account of the Fidelius arrangement, which Ragnarok has in his files and which explicitly names Pettigrew as secret keeper. Second, a witness statement from a Muggle who was present at the scene of the street incident, who described the event differently from the official record. She said the explosion came from the smaller man, who then disappeared. Third, there is no record of Sirius Black being questioned. Not a partial record, not a sealed record. No record at all. Under Wizarding law, a confession must be obtained under veritaserum in the presence of a certified Auror. No such record exists. So what do we do? Harry asked. We file an emergency petition for review with the Wisengamot, she said. Under Statute 14 of the Wizard Civil Rights Act, wrongful imprisonment is grounds for immediate suspension of the prisoner's custody pending review. The Guardian Clause gives us standing. As named secondary guardian, Black's legal status is directly relevant to Harry's welfare, which gives us a right to petition. How long will it take? The filing? An hour. The review hearing? She looked thoughtful. That depends on whether anyone tries to block it. If we can get on the emergency docket, we will, Ragnarok said, from behind his desk. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who knew exactly how much gold the Potter estate held and what that meant in practical terms. Bones glanced at him and said, right. Then potentially within the week. Harry sat with that. Within the week. Sirius Black had been in Azkaban for 7 years without a trial. A week was nothing. A week was also an enormous, concrete, specific piece of time, as opposed to forever, which was what it had been before last night. What's he like? Harry asked. Do you know him? Bones considered the question honestly rather than reaching for something comfortable. I knew of him, she said. He was an Auror, a good one, by reputation. Before. She paused. Azkaban does things to people. 7 years with the Dementors, she stopped again. He will not be the same man your father's notes describe. That's important to understand going in. Harry thought about the note. You know what to do. You always did, even when you pretended not to. He's still him though, Harry said. Underneath whatever Azkaban did. Bones looked at him with that not-quite softness again. We'll hope so, she said. The formal petition was filed at 2 in the afternoon, with Ragnar's signature alongside Bones and Harry's own, and Harry's signature on official wizarding documentation was, Ragnar explained, not a common event for an 8-year-old, and carried a formal weight beyond what the age might suggest, because the signature of a Potter on wizarding legal documents invoked the full authority of the ancient house, a privilege that had been dormant for 7 years and was now, definitively, no longer dormant. The clerk at the Wisengamot filing office looked at Harry's signature, then at Harry, then at Ragnar, and processed the petition without comment, but with slightly elevated color in her cheeks. Harry spent the afternoon in a small conference room at Gringotts, working through the estate documents with Ragnar in a way that was actually interesting, not like the school work he'd done at Privet Drive, grinding through exercises that went too slowly because the school had pegged him a year behind and not revisited the assessment, but actually interesting, because the estate documents were about real things with real stakes, and Ragnar explained them as though Harry's understanding was the goal rather than his compliance. He learned what a trust was and how it worked. He learned about the family seat on the Wizarding Governance Council, dormant since James Potter's death, available to Harry upon formal assumption of the headship of House Potter, which could not legally happen until he was 11 in usual circumstances, but which the activated Guardian Clause had begun a process that might allow for earlier recognition in a limited capacity. He learned about the Potter Library, which Ragnar described with a kind of dry reverence, over 2,000 texts, some of them unique, some of them predating the ministry itself. Can I go to it? Harry asked. The library. Not yet. It's part of the property in Shropshire, the one under the dissolved Fidelius. Once we've located it and verified access, how do we locate it? You said I'd be able to find it. How? Ragnar looked at him. The clause's activation should have triggered a navigational anchor in your family magic. You would need to, he paused, searching for an explanation that would work for an 8-year-old, reach for it. Deliberately. Not a physical action, an intentional one. Harry thought about the thunderstorm smell, the way it had come from inside rather than outside, the way it had responded to his blood on the parchment. He closed his eyes and reached, not out, exactly, but in, and then further in, past the ordinary awareness of his own body, towards something that he couldn't see but could sense the way you could sense a warm room from the cold corridor outside it. There was something there. Distant, patient, waiting. It felt like standing at the edge of a field you couldn't see the end of and knowing, without knowing how, that the field belonged to you. He opened his eyes. Ragnar was watching him with interest. Well, he said. Northwest of here, Harry said. A long way. Hills. The image I got was a valley with a stream. Ragnar made a note. That matches a region of Shropshire that James Potter's family records reference. We'll work on narrowing it down. Harry nodded. He felt slightly strange, not unpleasantly, just aware of something that hadn't been there before, or rather that had been there all along and was only now being used. Like a muscle you hadn't known you had. At 4 in the afternoon, a message arrived for Harry. Not an owl, he'd been vaguely expecting an owl, had gathered from context that this was how wizarding correspondence worked. Instead it was a small, folded piece of parchment that arrived in Ragnar's office via a system Harry gathered was the internal Gringotts post, having been delivered to the front desk by a ministry courier. It was from Assessor Bones. Short, clipped, the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly. Emergency petition accepted for the Wisengamot docket. Hearing scheduled for Thursday. Sirius Black to be transferred to Ministry Medical Facility pending review, standard protocol for guardianship assessment cases, thank the statute for that. He will be accessible for supervised interview as early as tomorrow. I'll be in contact. Bones. Harry read it twice. Then he put it down on Ragnar's desk and looked out the window. There was a window in the conference room, high up, showing a strip of late afternoon sky, grey and vaguely gold at the edges. Tomorrow. He would meet his godfather tomorrow. He would meet a man who had been in Azkaban for 7 years without a trial. A man his father had trusted above everyone. A man who thought he had no one left. Harry thought about the note again, "He's everything," and felt something move through his chest that was too big to fit neatly into a single word. Not grief, not exactly. Something that included grief but went further than it. "Ragnar," he said. "Yes. When all of this is done, Sirius, Vernon, Dumbledore, all of it, what does the world look like? For me." Ragnar was quiet for a moment. He set down his quill and looked at Harry with his full attention, those amber eyes steady and direct. "That depends on you," he said. "But I can tell you what it could look like. You could have proper guardianship. A home. An education commensurate with your actual intelligence, which, you should know, is considerably above average. You could have access to your family's resources, your family's history, your family's magic. You could have," he paused, "people who know what you are and choose to be in your life for that reason." Harry thought about Tom bringing soup up without being asked. About Bones saying you won't go in without knowing exactly what to expect. About Ragnar's word, given as a goblin, that the people responsible would be held accountable. "That sounds good," he said. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended, and more honest. "It won't be without difficulty," Ragnar said. "There are people who will push back on everything we've started today. Dumbledore will not be the last. The wizarding world has a story about you, the boy who lived, the child who defeated Voldemort, and it will resist having that story complicated by reality." "I don't care about their story," Harry said. "I didn't write it." Ragnar looked at him. Then, for the first time since Harry had met him, he smiled, a small thing, more in the eyes than the mouth, but real. "No," he said. "You didn't. And you're not obligated to live in it." Outside the window, the gold at the edges of the sky was deepening toward evening. Below them, somewhere in the labyrinth of vaults and corridors that ran under London like a second city, the Potter estate sat in its entirety, the gold, the library records, the investments, the family history, the weight and substance of generations, waiting for the boy who had been sleeping under some stairs to come and claim it. Harry stayed in the conference room until the light was gone, reading documents and asking questions and not once feeling small, and by the time Tom brought dinner up to his room at the Leaky Cauldron, a proper dinner, roast and potatoes and something that Harry ate entirely, he had begun, carefully, deliberately, like a person constructing something that needed to last, to feel like himself. He still didn't know exactly what that meant, who he was when he wasn't defined by a cupboard and a family that wasn't his. But he had the rest of his life to find out, and tonight, for the first time, the rest of his life felt like a real and specific thing. He slept again without dreaming, in the solid bed in the leaning room above Diagon Alley, while Wizarding London carried on around him, unknowing, unprepared, and about to be very significantly surprised. Chapter 3, The Black File. The Ministry of Magic's medical facility occupied the 4th sublevel of the building on Whitehall, accessible through a lift that required a wand tap and a verbal identification. Bones supplied both with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done it 100 times, and smelled predominantly of antiseptic charms and old stone. The walls were pale gray, the lighting was cool and even, and the whole place had the particular atmosphere of somewhere that had been designed to be calming and had overcorrected into something vaguely oppressive. Harry walked in behind Bones at 10 in the morning, 2 days after the Gringotts meeting, 1 day after the emergency petition had been formally accepted, and tried not to show that his heart was doing something uncomfortable in his chest. He had prepared. That was the word he kept using to himself, prepared, because it was more useful than nervous and more honest than fine. He'd spent yesterday evening in the Leaky Cauldron reading everything Ragnar had given him about Sirius Black. The horror file from before Azkaban, commendations, case closures, a note from a superior that said Black's instincts are almost irritatingly good. The arrest report, thin and slipshod, full of gaps that had apparently bothered no one at the time. A photograph, taken during his horror service in 1980, which showed a man laughing at something off-camera with the careless ease of someone who expected the world to keep being worth laughing at. The man in the photograph looked nothing like what Harry was about to walk into. He knew that. Bones had said it, Ragnarok had implied it, and 7 years was 7 years regardless. Still. He'd looked at the photograph for a long time before he went to sleep. The ward nurse, a young wizard with a clipboard who introduced himself as trainee healer Spence and then seemed to regret how young he sounded, led them down a corridor and stopped at a door near the end. "He's been unresponsive to most of the staff," Spence said quietly, addressing Bones but sliding a sideways look at Harry with the expression of someone uncertain whether a child should be here and equally uncertain whether they were allowed to say so. "He eats. Mostly. He doesn't cause trouble. But he hasn't, he's not communicating much." "How much is much?" Bones asked. "He said get out to the healer in charge yesterday." That was the longest sentence. Bones looked at the door, then at Harry. "You don't have to go in first." "I can, I'll go," Harry said. "Harry, he doesn't know you," Harry said. "No offense. But he doesn't know me either, and maybe that's," he stopped, worked it out. "My dad's notes. They're in the box. Did you bring the copies?" Bones patted the folder under her arm. "Right here. Can I take them in?" She pulled out a specific sheet, Harry's copy of the page with James's handwriting on it, the one that ended "He's everything," and handed it over without comment. Harry took it, looked at the door, and knocked. No answer. He opened it anyway. The room was not a cell. That was the first thing Harry registered. It was clearly a medical room, a proper one, with a real bed and a chair and a window that showed a strip of magic sky outside, perpetually noon. But Sirius Black was sitting on the floor in the corner between the bed and the wall, and that detail caught in Harry's chest and stayed there. He was thin. Not thin in the lean, fit way the horror photograph had shown, thin in the way that meant a long time without enough, a long time of the body consuming itself. His hair was black and very long, hanging past his shoulders, and his face was all hollows and sharp angles, the kind of face that had once had more to it. He was wearing ministry-issued clothes, plain gray, and he was looking at the floor. He didn't look up when Harry came in. Harry crossed the room, sat down on the edge of the bed, the only seating available besides the chair, which was further away and wrong somehow, and didn't say anything for a moment. Sirius Black's hands were resting on his knees. His fingers were very still. He had the quality of stillness, Harry thought, of something that had learned to stop moving because movement had not helped and had eventually given up asking whether it might. "I'm Harry," Harry said. "Harry Potter." Nothing. The stillness didn't change. But something in it, the quality of it, shifted slightly, the way a sleeping person shifts without waking. "I found the box," Harry said. "In my aunt and uncle's house. The will, the clause. Everything." He paused. "I activated it, which apparently sends an alert to Gringotts. Ragnarok's been trying to contact someone about the estate for 6 years, and finding out I'd activated the clause was apparently the best day he'd had in a while, even if he didn't show it." A very long silence. Then, from the floor, in a voice that was rough and underused and had clearly not been doing much work recently, "Ragnarok." "Yeah. He still has the." Sirius stopped. Cleared his throat. "He had a file. On the estate. He was always very thorough. He has about 40 files," Harry said. "The whole room, basically." Something moved through Sirius's face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of a muscle memory. "That sounds right." Harry reached into his pocket and held out the sheet of parchment, the one with James's handwriting. "This was in the box. I thought you should see it." Sirius looked at the parchment the way you look at something when you're not sure whether looking is safe. Then he reached out and took it. His hand was steadier than Harry had expected. He read it. Harry watched him read it, watched the way his jaw tightened, watched something move behind his eyes that was too complex to name, grief and something older than grief, something that had had 7 years to compound into shapes that didn't have clean labels. He always did that, Sirius said, to the parchment rather than Harry. Signed off letters like that. Look after him. As if you needed to be told. His voice was rough, but it was working now, actually carrying meaning. As if the looking after wasn't the obvious part. Harry said nothing. Sirius looked up. Really looked, for the first time since Harry had come in, and his eyes were grey, light grey, almost silver, and still sharp in a way that Azkaban had apparently not been able to reach, the sharpness sitting deep in there behind everything else like a candle in a storm lantern. He looked at Harry for a long time. You have his eyes, he said. James's face, but Lily's eyes. She had the green. His voice went slightly rough on that last word. You were so small. When I saw you. You fit in one arm. I'm told I've grown, Harry said. The ghost of a muscle memory moved through Sirius's face again, and this time it actually made it. It was a terrible smile. Barely there, crooked, hesitant as a first step after a long time sitting still. But it was real and it was his, and Harry felt something in his chest loosen one careful increment. James would have loved that, Sirius said. He would have. He stopped. Pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. Looked at the parchment again. Then he said, very quietly, I didn't do it. I need you to know that. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I need to say it, I know you didn't, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. Ragnarok has the Fidelius documentation. Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper, not you. My dad's notes make it clear. Assessor Bones filed a petition for review with the Wisengamot 2 days ago, it's on the emergency docket. The hearing's on Thursday. Harry kept his voice matter-of-fact. Not because he wasn't feeling things, he absolutely was, but because Sirius looked like someone who needed facts right now, solid things to hold on to, and Harry could give him that. You're going to get a proper trial. And then you're going to get out. The silence that followed was different from the silence when Harry had walked in. That one had been an absence. This one was full, packed with something that Sirius Black was clearly not yet equipped to let out in any organized fashion, and so it sat in him visibly, moving through his expression in waves. The hearing, his voice broke, and he controlled it, Thursday. That's 3 days. 3 days. He said it like a man testing whether a surface would hold his weight. And you, he looked at Harry, really looked, with an intensity that had nothing threatening in it and everything desperate in the best possible way, you filed the petition. My signature was on it. Ragnarok and Bones did the work. You're 8 years old. Everyone keeps mentioning that, Harry said. Sirius made a sound that was not quite a laugh but came from the same place. It sounded like something that had been sealed off for a long time and had found a crack. Bones came in after 40 minutes and conducted the formal interview with a competence that managed to be thorough without being cold, recording Sirius's account of November 1981 in detail, the discovery of the Fidelius switch, the pursuit of Pettigrew, the confrontation in the street, the explosion. Sirius's voice was level throughout, with the practiced control of a man who had gone over the events so many times in his own head that they had become almost clinical, stripped of effect by sheer repetition. Harry sat and listened and filed everything away. When it was done and Bones stepped out to make a fireplace call, Sirius looked at Harry sideways. What happens, he said, if the hearing goes wrong? Harry met his eyes. It won't. But if, Ragnarok is prepared to present the Gringotts documentation directly to the Wisengamot. The original Fidelius record, my father's notes, the witness statement from the Muggle woman at the scene. Bones has already confirmed there's no Veritaserum confession in the arrest record, which is technically a fatal procedural flaw that voids the conviction under Statute 14 regardless of the evidence. Harry counted it off steadily. They have nothing. The original conviction was built on panic and assumption and someone not asking the right questions. We're asking them. Sirius stared at him. How long were you reading those files? Most of yesterday. James always did that too, Sirius said. Read everything and then act like the reading was the obvious part. He was quiet for a moment. Was it bad? The Dursleys? Harry considered the question from several angles and then said, I'll tell you all of it when you're out. When we have time. He said we deliberately, watched it land in Sirius's expression, watched the gray eyes process it. Yeah, Sirius said, quietly. Okay. Thursday came with low gray sky and the particular silence of a building gearing up for something significant. Harry had been awake since 6, had eaten breakfast properly because Ragnarok had been very specific about you will eat a proper breakfast, and was in the antechamber of the Wisingamot courtroom at 8:30 in dark robes that Ragnarok had arranged for him, simple, well-made, bearing the Potter family mark on the left breast, a detail that Harry had noticed several people noticing. Ragnarok stood beside him with a briefcase that appeared to contain approximately half the contents of his office. Bones was reviewing notes in her folder. A legal advocate from the Wizarding Civil Rights Office named Carmichael, a slight, fast-talking wizard with ink on his fingers who had apparently handled 3 wrongful imprisonment cases and won all of them, was going through the presentation structure in a low urgent voice with his assistant. And Dumbledore was there. He was standing near the far wall, speaking quietly with a member of the Wisingamot who Harry didn't recognize, an older witch in violet robes who was nodding slowly, her expression complicated. Dumbledore looked up when Harry entered and held his gaze for a moment. He nodded once, which Harry interpreted as acknowledgement rather than approval, and turned back to his conversation. He's trying to influence the proceedings, Harry said quietly. Ragnarok didn't turn his head. Yes. Can we stop him? We don't need to stop him. We need to be better. He glanced at Harry sideways. Which we are. The courtroom itself was, Harry had expected something like the Muggle courts he'd seen on Aunt Petunia's programs, wood-paneled and formal. This was more like a theater, tiered rows of seats in a semicircle above a circular floor, the walls carved with what appeared to be a continuous narrative in stone depicting moments of wizarding legal history. The Wisingamot members were seated in the upper tiers in their plum-colored robes, 40-some witches and wizards whose collective expression as Harry walked into the room was, broadly speaking, the expression of people who had been told to expect something and were recalibrating. Sirius was brought in through a side door. He was standing up, properly upright, which was somehow different from the ministry-issue gray corner of 3 days ago. He was dressed in clean robes, his hair pulled back, and he looked, Harry thought, like someone who had decided to be something recognizable again and was working at it with everything he had. His eyes found Harry immediately and held. Harry nodded once. Sirius's shoulders dropped half an inch, the specific drop of someone who had been carrying something and had just, fractionally, been allowed to put part of it down. Chief Warlock Tiberius Ogden called the hearing to order with a tap of his wand that rang through the stone room like a bell. He was a broad, white-haired man with the manner of someone who had seen enough to be unimpressed by almost anything but was reserving judgment. This hearing has been convened under the Emergency Review Statute, Petition Reference 1138b, regarding the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black, filed by Assessor Miriam Bones on behalf of the petitioner, Harry James Potter, ward of the Potter estate. Ogden's voice was clear and measured. This is not a full trial. This is a review hearing to determine whether the original imprisonment was procedurally sound and whether the evidence supporting conviction meets the standard required under wizarding law. Advocate Carmichael, you may begin. Carmichael stood and began. He was good. Harry had known he was good from the 45 minutes he'd watched him prepare, but seeing him in the room was different. He had the gift of making complexity feel inevitable, laying out each piece of the case in sequence so that by the time you reached the conclusion it felt less like an argument and more like basic arithmetic. Sirius Black had not been tried. A trial was legally required. The absence of a trial made the imprisonment invalid on its face. Everything else, the Fidelius documentation, the witness statement, the forensic anomalies in the original explosion report, was supplementary, each piece landing like a stone in still water. Several Wisengamot members were taking notes. 3 of them had the expression of people working out how this had happened on their watch. Then Carmichael said, "I would now like to call Harry James Potter to make a statement." A ripple went through the chamber. Not loud, just a collective shift, a shared breath, 40 people adjusting. Harry stood up, straightened his robes, and walked to the speaking position in the center of the floor. He looked up at the tiered rows of plum-colored robes and did not feel small. He had thought about what he was going to say and had decided, in the end, not to plan it too carefully. Plans for speeches had a way of sounding like speeches. "My name is Harry Potter," he said. His voice carried clearly in the stone room. "I'm 8 years old. 3 days ago I found a copy of my parents' will in a hidden compartment in my uncle's house. Before that, I didn't know the will existed. I didn't know about the estate, or the guardian clause, or the godfather who was supposed to look after me." He paused. "I also didn't know that the man who was supposed to be my godfather had been locked up without a trial. So I want to say clearly, for the record, that none of this was kept from me by accident. Someone made a series of choices that kept me without any of the legal protections that my parents arranged for me, and put the person they trusted most with my care in a prison where he had no voice and no recourse and no one asking the right questions." Dead quiet in the chamber. "I'm not here to accuse anyone today," Harry continued. "That's for other hearings. Today I'm here because Sirius Black is my godfather, and he was named my guardian by my parents, and he has been imprisoned without trial for 7 years. The documents that Advocate Carmichael has presented are my family's documents. The evidence is clear. I'm asking this court to do what should have been done in 1981. He looked across the chamber floor to where Sirius was sitting. Sirius was looking at him with an expression that Harry couldn't fully read, something between gratitude and grief and something fiercer than both, and Harry held his gaze for one steady moment before turning back to the Wisengamot. "That's all I have," he said. He walked back to his seat. Ragnarok was looking straight ahead but said, quietly, without moving, "Well done." The Wisengamot retired to deliberate at 11:40. They came back at 12:15. Ogden read the outcome in the same measured voice he'd used throughout, which made it no less significant. The original imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black was formally declared procedurally invalid under Statute 14, Section 3 of the Wizard Civil Rights Act, due to the absence of a formal trial within the required 30-day window. This declaration did not constitute a finding of innocence in itself. A formal trial would need to be scheduled, but it meant that continued imprisonment pending that trial was illegal, and Sirius Black was therefore to be released immediately into supervised custody pending trial, with the nominated supervisor being the Potter estate, Ragnarok said, before Ogden could finish the sentence. "Under my direct oversight as account manager." Ogden looked at him over his reading glasses. "The petition names Gringotts as the supervising party, yes." "Then we are in agreement," Ragnarok said, pleasantly. Across the chamber, Harry saw Dumbledore's expression, still, considered, something working behind those blue eyes that wasn't quite acceptance and wasn't quite resistance. He was calculating. Harry had learned enough about him in 2 days to recognize the movement of his thinking even from across a room. But there was nothing to be done. The Wisengamot had spoken. The documentation was clear. And Gringotts, Ragnarok had explained to Harry the night before, was not an institution that the Ministry or Dumbledore could simply override, because Gringotts was older than the Ministry and considerably less interested in politics. Sirius was unshackled by a Ministry officer who looked like he'd rather be somewhere else. He stood up and straightened his robes, and then he looked at Harry, and Harry looked back, and the space between them across the courtroom floor felt specific and important. Harry crossed it. He didn't overthink it. He walked across the court and stopped in front of Sirius and said, "Right. That's done." Sirius looked down at him. He was taller than Harry had registered in the medical facility, properly tall, the build of someone who had been broad and capable before Azkaban had worked on him. His grey eyes were sharp and raw and about a dozen other things at once. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough. "That's done." There was a pause. Then Harry said, "Are you hungry?" because it was the most practical thing he could think of and also, he suspected, the most needed. Something cracked open in Sirius's face, a real thing this time, wide and unguarded and slightly disbelieving, the expression of a man who had not been asked a kind ordinary question in 7 years, and he laughed. A short, startled sound, nothing like the easy laughter of the horror photograph, but genuine. Actually genuine. "Yeah," he said again. "Actually. I'm starving." "Tom does a full lunch," Harry said. "At the Leaky Cauldron. I've been staying there." "Tom's still running the place?" "Apparently." Sirius ran a hand through his hair, the gesture of a man reconnecting with his own body, remembering that he had hands and hair and habits. "Right then," he said. "Lead the way." They walked to the Leaky Cauldron through the grey London morning, just the two of them plus Bones and Ragnarok following at a discreet distance that was both respectful and, Harry suspected, professionally required. Sirius walked like someone relearning the mechanics of it, not badly, not with obvious difficulty, but with a kind of concentrated awareness that suggested he was paying attention to each step on purpose. He stopped once on the street outside a newsagent. Stood still for a moment, looking at the Muggle street with its cars and pedestrians and ordinary Tuesday morning noise. 7 years, he said, not particularly to Harry. "It's the same." "Is that good or bad?" Sirius thought about it honestly. "Both," he said. Then he kept walking. Tom absolutely saw them coming through the door and absolutely did not cry, on account of being a professional, but his eyes were doing something that was making a very serious effort in that direction. He managed a "Mr. Black, sir, welcome back," that was very dignified, and Sirius said, "Tom, you absolute legend," in a way that made Tom cover his face with his cleaning rag and turn to go get the food. They sat at a corner table, Harry, Sirius, and a meal that Tom brought out in stages as though trying to find a natural stopping point and failing. Sirius ate with the focused attention of someone engaging with the concept of flavor for the first time in a while. He was quiet for most of the first course, and Harry let him be quiet, because he'd learned early that silence was frequently the most useful thing you could offer and also because he was hungry himself. After the soup and most of the bread, Sirius sat back and looked at Harry with those sharp grey eyes. "Tell me about the Dursleys," he said. "All of it." Harry told him. He kept his voice level and factual, the same way he'd spoken in the hearing, because it was still the most effective way to say things and also because he didn't want Sirius to feel like he needed to manage Harry's feelings when his own were clearly already under significant load. He told him about the cupboard. The camp bed. The hand-me-down clothes and the single birthday that had passed for 8 years unremarked. The food, enough but not enough. The marks on his arms, which were fading now but had been documented by Bones. Sirius listened without speaking. His jaw was tight. His hands on the table were flat and still in a way that suggested some effort. When Harry finished, Sirius said, "I should have been there." "You were in Azkaban." "Before that." "When Dumbledore placed you." "I was brought in that first night, did you know that?" "After the attack on Godric's Hollow, I was one of the first on the scene." "I saw you, I wanted to take you." "I should have taken you." The muscle in his jaw moved. "I made a different choice. I went after Peter instead. I thought, if I got him, if I could explain," he stopped. "I thought there would be time to come back for you after." Harry looked at him. "There was no way to know. I knew Peter was dangerous and I knew you were alone and I chose Peter." His voice was flat and direct, not self-pitying, just honest. "That's what happened. I don't want to dress it up." "You were trying to get justice for my parents," Harry said. "For me." It wasn't a bad choice. It was the wrong outcome. You sound like James, Sirius said. He was always better at the distinction than I was. What was he like? The question came out quietly and Harry hadn't entirely decided to ask it, but Sirius's expression shifted immediately. The tension didn't leave but something opened alongside it, making room. He was infuriating, Sirius said, and his voice warmed as he said it. He was the most infuriating person I've ever known, and I've known some genuinely spectacular idiots. He thought every problem was solvable if you applied enough creativity, which was sometimes brilliant and sometimes absolutely catastrophic. He pranked a professor in third year by charming all his written notes to rearrange into the lyrics of a Welsh folk song mid-lecture. He spent a year and a half being comprehensively ignored by Lily Evans, who was the only person who'd ever managed to genuinely intimidate him, and his response was to become actually worth paying attention to. A pause. He loved you before you existed. He talked about his kids, not a kid, kids, plural, he had the whole thing mapped out, from the time we were 15. He said he was going to be the kind of father you could tell things to. Harry sat with that. And Lily? Lily was the cleverest person in any room she walked into, and she always knew it and never used it to make anyone feel small, which is rarer than it sounds. Sirius looked at Harry's eyes, the green ones. She was the one who drafted most of the protective enchantments. The sacrifice, the blood protection, the claws, those were her architecture. James's instinct, her execution. He paused. She would have built you something better than Privet Drive, I can tell you that. She did, Harry said. She built the claws. Sirius looked at him. 8 years later, Harry said, it worked. Just like she designed it. So she did build me something better. Something happened in Sirius's face that was too quick and too private for Harry to describe, but it left the lines of him slightly different afterward, slightly less carved. Ragnarok appeared at the edge of the table with the precise timing of someone who had been watching from the bar and had chosen his moment with the instinct of a professional. I don't mean to interrupt, he said, in the tone of a man who absolutely did mean to interrupt and had weighed it against the alternative and concluded it was worth it. But there are several things requiring attention before the end of today. The formal trial date for Mr. Black has been provisionally set for 4 weeks from Thursday. I have also received confirmation from the Wizarding Family Court that the custody hearing regarding Mr. Potter's guardianship is scheduled for next week. And, he placed a sealed envelope on the table. This arrived from Assessor Bones an hour ago. Harry picked up the envelope. Inside was a short note in Bones's handwriting. Formal charges filed against Vernon Dursley, Muggle Court, child cruelty, child neglect, failure in duty of care. Wizarding Court, knowing concealment of a magical ward's identity and estate, interference with a guardian clause. This last one requires some creative legal work, but I think it holds. Petunia Dursley cautioned and given immunity in exchange for testimony. Dursley's solicitor has already indicated he plans to plea manage. He'll fight it. That's fine. So will we. More soon, Bones. Harry set the note down. He's going to try to make it seem like he was doing what he thought was right, Harry said. Vernon. He'll say he didn't know, or he didn't understand, or he was just following what Dumbledore arranged. Yes, said Ragnarok. He did know, Harry said. Not everything, but enough. The compartment was sealed with a magical lock. He knew there was something magical in his house. He locked it away. He paused. He knew I was magical. That's why he stopped. Completed the thought internally. That's why he did what he did. Not random cruelty. Targeted. Sirius was very still across the table. I'm going to testify, Harry said. And I'm going to be very clear. Are you certain? Ragnarok asked. Not with any suggestion that he shouldn't, just checking. Yes. Then we will prepare you well. Ragnarok picked up the envelope. I'll coordinate with Bones. He turned to go, then paused and looked at Sirius. "Mr. Black. Welcome back. I have approximately 93 questions for you regarding several aspects of the Potter estate management that will require a guardian's input. None of them are urgent today." Sirius blinked. Then, slowly, he said, 93. "I have been waiting 7 years," Ragnarok said simply, and walked back toward the bar. Sirius turned to Harry. "Is he always?" "Yes," Harry said. "Brilliant," Sirius said. He reached for the bread basket, found it empty, and looked around for Tom, who appeared immediately with a fresh one as though he'd been waiting in the wings. Sirius took a roll, looked at it, then looked at Harry. "We're going to be okay," he said. Not a reassurance exactly. More like something he was deciding out loud, firmly, in the way that people who have come back from very dark places sometimes decide things, with the full weight of knowing what the alternative looks like. "Yeah," Harry said. "We are." Outside the leaky cauldron, London went on around them, muggle and magical, ordinary and extraordinary, layered on top of each other in the usual way. Somewhere in Whitehall, Vernon Dursley was talking to a solicitor. Somewhere in the ministry, people were processing the morning's hearing with varying degrees of comfort. And somewhere in a valley in Shropshire, a property under a dissolved Fidelius charm sat patiently in the hills with a library and a history and a welcome home written into its oldest stones, waiting to be found. Harry drank his tea and listened to Sirius tell a story about James and a stolen boat and a lake that turned out to be considerably deeper than anyone had expected, and felt, for the second time since Monday morning, something that was beginning to resemble joy. It was a tentative thing, still new to its own weight. But it was real, and it was his. And nobody, was putting it back in a cupboard. Chapter 4, Trial by Fire. The Wizarding family court occupied a different wing of the ministry than the Wisingamot chambers, smaller, less theatrical, with lower ceilings and warmer lighting and the general atmosphere of a place that dealt with human damage on a daily basis and had made certain practical adjustments to that fact. The waiting room had actual chairs. There were plants. Someone had put a jug of water on a table by the door with a stack of cups beside it, which Harry thought was either a very considerate touch or a very telling one, depending on how you looked at it. Harry sat in one of the chairs and went through his notes. He had notes because Bones had spent 3 evenings preparing him. Not coaching, she'd been very specific about the distinction. She wasn't going to tell him what to say, she'd said, because what he needed to say was the truth and the truth didn't require coaching. What she was going to do was tell him exactly how the proceedings worked, what kinds of questions the court advocate would ask, what Vernon's solicitor would try to do, and how to handle the specific techniques used to discredit child witnesses. "He'll try to make you seem unreliable," she told him, sitting across the table at the leaky cauldron with her folder open and her reading glasses on. Children who come from difficult situations often have complicated relationships with the truth, not because they lie, but because they've learned to present themselves a certain way for self-protection. His solicitor will try to find that pattern in you and use it. "What do I do?" "Answer what you're asked. Not more, not less. If you don't understand a question, say so. If something stated as a premise in a question is wrong, correct it before you answer. And," she'd looked at him over her glasses, "don't perform anything. Don't perform distress, don't perform composure. Just be exactly what you are." Harry had thought about what he was, exactly, and had decided that what he was someone who had read approximately 200 pages of case documentation in the past week and had an extremely clear memory and a very low tolerance for being managed. He thought he could work with that. Sirius was in the seat next to him, one leg crossed over the other, a stillness about him that was different from the stillness of the medical facility, less the stillness of something switched off, more the stillness of something coiled. He was better. Not recovered, Harry didn't think 7 years undid in a week, but more present, more himself in outline. He'd been at the leaky cauldron every day, eating Tom's food and sleeping in an actual bed and, Harry had noticed, spending significant portions of each morning simply sitting in the leaky cauldron's small back garden looking at the sky with the focused attention of someone relearning what regular sky looked like. He'd also spent a lot of time with Harry. They'd talked about James mostly, Sirius talking, Harry listening and occasionally asking questions, building up a picture of his father from fragments and anecdotes the way you built a mosaic, individual pieces adding up to something you could stand back and recognize. And sometimes they'd talked about other things, Quidditch, which Harry gathered was important and sounded genuinely exciting, and the wizarding world, which was enormous and strange and apparently full of things nobody had thought to tell him about yet. Sirius was a good explainer when he was engaged, which was most of the time now, the words coming faster as each day added a bit more of him back. Remus had come on the 4th day. Harry had heard him before he'd seen him, Sirius's voice-changing register in the bar below Harry's room, going from its normal pitch to something quieter and rougher and less composed, and then a second voice, lower, careful, and the sound of two people working out how to be in the same room after a long time apart. Harry had stayed upstairs for 20 minutes to give them the space, and when he'd come down, there were two men at the corner table and one of them had clearly been crying recently in the private way that meant he was finished now and they were not going to discuss it. Remus Lupin was thin in a different way from Sirius, not Azkaban thin but worn thin, the thinness of someone who'd been carrying something difficult for a long time without putting it down. He had sandy hair going grey at the temples, a scar along his jaw, and eyes that were warm and tired and looked at Harry with an expression that came apart slightly at the edges before he put it back together. "You look like James," he'd said, which Harry was getting used to, and Lily, which he was also getting used to, and then nothing else for a moment because Remus appeared to be having feelings that he was handling with his usual method of not handling them out loud. Sirius had said, "Moony, breathe," and Remus had said, "I am breathing," in the tone of a man who was technically correct about this and felt it was insufficient. Harry had liked him immediately. He was here today too, sitting on Harry's other side, occasionally exchanging a quiet word with Sirius over Harry's head, the two of them forming something that felt involuntarily like a bracket. Harry didn't mind. The bracket was warm and it was facing outward and it was something he didn't have a practiced word for yet because he'd never experienced it before, but his body apparently knew what it was because it relaxed in a way it hadn't in a long time. The door to the corridor opened and Bones came in, folder under her arm, and behind her was a woman Harry hadn't met, a solicitor from the Wizarding Civil Rights Office named Pruitt, who was there for the combined Muggle-Wizarding coordinated hearing, an unusual arrangement that had required considerable administrative effort and which everyone involved seemed faintly proud of, in the specific way of people who have made a complicated system do something it wasn't designed to do. "They're ready for us," Bones said. She looked at Harry. "How are you?" "Ready," he said. She looked at him for a moment, something moving through her expression. "Right," she said. "Let's go." The court was smaller than Harry had expected, a rectangular room with paneled walls and a raised bench at the far end where two people sat, a wizard named Magistrate Flint and a Muggle woman named Magistrate Davies, the joint bench being another product of Bones's creative legal work. The arrangement had required a specific ministry waiver, 3 forms of interdepartmental clearance, and a very patient conversation with the Muggle legal authority that Bones described as, not technically lying, per se. Vernon Dursley was already there. Harry hadn't seen him since Privet Drive. He was sitting at a table to the left with his solicitor, a compact, precise Muggle man named Hartley who had the expression of someone who had reviewed the evidence and was working very hard on finding angles that didn't exist, and he was wearing a suit instead of his dressing gown, which made him look more like Vernon and less like the deflated version Harry had last seen at the kitchen table. He was still pink. He was radiating a specific kind of aggrieved dignity, the dignity of a man who believed himself fundamentally decent and was here to make that case. He looked at Harry when Harry entered and his face did something complicated and quickly covered. Harry met his gaze for a moment, no particular expression, no hostility, no flinching, and then looked away and sat down. Petunia was not there. She'd been given immunity in exchange for testimony, which meant her account of events would be read into the record rather than given in person. Harry had read her statement. It was fascinating in the way that truly self-serving documents are always fascinating, technically accurate about most of the facts and somehow, despite that accuracy, managing to cast everything in a light that suggested she had done her best with a difficult situation. She talked about Harry the way you talked about a structural problem in your house. A thing that was there, required management, had implications you hadn't asked for. The hearings began. Bones presented the case for the Wizarding Court first, the clause activation, the documented evidence from Gringotts, the estate findings, the school welfare reports and their suppression. She was precise and unhurried and gave the impression of someone who had considerably more ammunition than she was currently using, which, Harry knew, was accurate. Then Pruitt handled the Muggle side, the child welfare documentation, the physical evidence, the school records. She was shorter in presentation but equally pointed. Hartley cross-examined both. He was good. Harry watched him work and recognized the techniques Bones had described. He pressed on definitions, on the threshold between neglect and substandard provision, on the question of whether the Dursleys had been given adequate information about Harry's needs. He was methodical and patient and building toward something. What he was building toward became clear when Magistrate Flint said, "We'll now hear from the minor witness, Harry Potter." Harry walked to the chair set in the open space between the two tables. Not a box, not a stand, a plain chair, which he appreciated. He sat down and looked at both magistrates and waited. The court advocate for the Wizarding side went first, a gentle, structured questioning that covered the basic facts. Where Harry had slept. What he had eaten. Whether he had received medical attention. Whether he had known about his parents, his estate, his magical identity. Harry answered each question directly, factually, completely. His voice was clear and the room was quiet enough that it carried without effort. Then Hartley stood up. "Harry," he said, with the particular warmth of a solicitor who wanted to establish rapport and was being very deliberate about it. "Thank you for being here today. I want to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that there are no wrong answers. I'm just looking to understand the full picture. Is that all right?" "Yes," Harry said. "You lived at number 4, Privet Drive, for approximately 7 years. From when I was 1 until last week. So yes, roughly 7 years. And during those 7 years, you had shelter. Food. Clothing. Access to a school. Yes. The Dursleys provided those things consistently. Yes." Hartley nodded, as though this had established something meaningful. "So when you say your living conditions were inadequate, you're speaking in comparison to, what, exactly? An ideal you've constructed, or a standard you were aware of at the time?" Harry looked at him for a moment. "I slept in a cupboard under the stairs," he said. "Not a bedroom converted from a storage space. A cupboard. The house had 4 bedrooms. Dudley used 2 of them, one for sleeping and one for his toys. Vernon and Petunia used one. The 4th was a guest room. I slept in the cupboard." I'm answering your question," Harry said, politely. "You asked me to explain the standard. The standard was, the house contained sufficient bedrooms for me to have one. I was not given one. That's not an ideal I constructed, it's arithmetic." Hartley shifted slightly. "As a young child, your perception of your circumstances was necessarily limited. I knew what a bedroom was," Harry said. "I'd seen Dudley's. I knew the difference between sleeping in a room with a window and sleeping in a space under the stairs with coats above the bed. You don't need a philosophical framework for that. You just need eyes." Someone in the room made a sound that they immediately suppressed. Hartley moved on. "You've described your uncle as being physically," he checked his notes with unnecessary deliberateness, "physically punitive. But children's memories of discipline can sometimes be. My school filed 2 welfare reports," Harry said. "I didn't ask them to. I didn't even know they had. Those reports are in Assessor Bones's documentation. They're not my memory, they're contemporary records from adults who saw something and tried to do something about it, and were then told there was nothing to worry about." He paused. "I also have the marks. Bones documented them when I arrived at the ministry facility. Those aren't memories either." Hartley paused. He was recalibrating. Harry could see it, the slight adjustment in how he was holding himself, the micro-shift in strategy. He tried a different angle. "Mr. Dursley is not a wizard," he said. He had no context for, "He knew I was magical," Harry said. The compartment in his study contained documents sealed with a magical lock. That lock opened in response to my blood, to a genetic marker, essentially. There's no Muggle mechanism that could have sealed it. Vernon Dursley had a magically sealed compartment in his study. He knew what that meant well enough to lock it away and never mention it. Harry kept his voice level. He knew I was magical. He was afraid of it. And he spent 7 years making sure that I was too small and too isolated and too uninformed to do anything about either. The room was very quiet. Hartley had no more angles. Harry could see that too, the moment when a line of questioning collapses under its own assumptions, like a table with a leg pulled out. The solicitor looked at his notes, made the decision, and said, "No further questions." Magistrate Davies looked at Harry over her bench. She was a small woman with reading glasses and a very direct quality of attention, the kind of person who had spent a long career looking at difficult things without looking away. "Harry," she said, "I want to ask you one question directly, and I want you to answer it in whatever way feels honest to you. Not for the record, just between us, speaking plainly." Harry waited. "How are you?" she asked. The room was still. Harry thought about it, really thought, not about what he should say but about what was true. He thought about the cupboard and the camp bed and the crack in the ceiling like a lightning bolt. He thought about the thunderstorm smell and the box with his parents' handwriting in it. He thought about Ragnarok across a desk saying what was done to you was wrong and meaning it. He thought about Sirius laughing in the leaky cauldron, that startled, rusty sound, and Remus's tired warm eyes and Tom's soup appearing without being asked. "I'm better than I was," he said. "And I think I'm going to be fine." Davies held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Thank you," she said. "You may sit down." Vernon gave his statement after lunch. He was composed. That was the first thing Harry noticed, more composed than Harry had expected, more composed than the pink and blustering man of Privet Drive. He had clearly been prepared carefully. He spoke about the challenges of a situation that had been forced upon his family, about the duty he had felt as a decent man to honor his wife's obligations to her nephew, about the difficulty of raising a child with, he paused significantly here, particular tendencies. "Tendencies," Magistrate Flint repeated. "Unusual incidents," Vernon said carefully. "Things that happened around the boy that were difficult to understand or manage." "You mean magic," Harry said, from his seat. Hartley was on his feet immediately. "Objection, this is not a criminal court," Magistrate Flint said drily, "and he's 8. Continue, Mr. Dursley." Vernon looked at Harry. His expression was difficult to read, not quite the contempt of Privet Drive, not quite the deflated thing from the kitchen table at 3 in the morning. Something between the two, with something else underneath it that Harry thought might be, in Vernon's own limited vocabulary, a form of regret. Not regret for what he'd done, necessarily. Regret for the situation. Regret that any of this had happened to him. "I didn't know how to handle it," Vernon said. "I won't pretend I did. I did the best I could with what I had." "The best you could," Harry said, not loudly, not angrily, just naming it. "Okay." Something moved through Vernon's face. "I provided for you, you put me in a cupboard," Harry said. "You had 4 bedrooms." You knew about the estate," Harry said. "You had a sealed compartment in your study. You knew those documents were there. And you decided that I would never find out." He paused. "That wasn't inadequacy. That was a choice." Hartley objected again. Flint let it stand this time with a gentle reminder that witnesses were to address the bench rather than each other. Harry turned back to the magistrates and said, "Apologies," and let it rest. But the thing had been said. The thing had been said in a quiet, clear voice by an 8-year-old boy with green eyes and ink-stained fingers from a week of reading case files, and it was in the room now with everyone in it, and Vernon Dursley's solicitor could object as many times as he liked and it would still be there. The session finished at 4. The magistrates retired to deliberate. They'd return with a preliminary finding within the week, and the formal sentencing, if applicable, would follow a fuller hearing. It was process, as Bones explained to Harry in the corridor afterward. It was process and it took time and it was not the last word. But it went well? Harry asked. Bones looked at him. It went extremely well, she said, with the careful understatement of someone who meant it went better than I had any right to expect. Sirius was waiting in the corridor. He'd been in the public gallery for the afternoon session, technically permitted, as Harry's named guardian pending the formal hearing, and he fell into step beside Harry without comment for a few seconds. Then he said, "You told Hartley it was arithmetic." "It was. You said you just need eyes to a professional solicitor." "I mean, I wasn't wrong, Harry." Sirius stopped walking. He looked at Harry with those grey eyes, sharp and warm, and something else, something that was still finding its shape after years of having no space to form. "Your father once told a Wisengamot panel that their logic had the structural integrity of wet toast. Did it work?" "Brilliantly." They dropped the motion. He paused. He was 17. "You're 8. I'll have more material by 17, Harry said. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, a light touch, careful, the gesture of a man who was relearning what affection felt like in practice and was being deliberate about each step. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Remus appeared from further down the corridor looking like he'd spent the afternoon in the gallery trying not to make audible sounds and had mostly succeeded. He looked at Harry with those tired, warm eyes. "Bones is going to have to stop you from going into actual law," he said. "Just to preserve the profession's dignity." "It was straightforward," Harry said. "You demolished a professional solicitor's case structure using basic spatial reasoning and then apologized to the magistrate for it." "I was being polite." Remus opened his mouth, found nothing adequate, and closed it again. They walked back through the ministry together, the three of them, Harry, Sirius, Remus, through the atrium with its golden fountain and its bustling afternoon crowd of witches and wizards who mostly didn't notice them and occasionally very much did. Harry was getting used to the noticing. The startled recognition, the whisper, the person who just a fraction too obviously looked away. He dealt with it the way he dealt with most things, which was to acknowledge it privately and continue with what he was doing. They were nearly at the fireplace bank, the ministry fireplaces connected to the Fleur network, which Harry had used twice now and was still finding somewhat alarming, when a voice said, "Mr. Potter." It was coming from a man in ministry robes, deep blue rather than plum, who was standing near the fountain with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of carefully arranged pleasantness. He was tall and slim with pale blonde hair and pale grey eyes that were the same color as Sirius's but completely different in quality, cool where Sirius's were warm, measuring where Sirius's were direct. Harry stopped. Sirius, beside him, went very still. The particular stillness of someone who recognized something. "And Mr. Black," the man said, nodding. "Welcome back." There was a world in those two words, and none of it was welcoming. "Malfoy," Sirius said. One word, flat and level. Lucius Malfoy. Harry had encountered the name in the estate documents, one of the Wizarding Governance Council members who had voted, in 1981, on the emergency motion to formally declare Voldemort's defeat and close the Order of the Phoenix inquiry without a full investigation. The vote had passed 7-4. Malfoy had been one of the 7. "I simply wanted to extend my congratulations on the hearing's outcome," Malfoy said to Harry, with the air of a man performing a courtesy that cost him precisely nothing. "The Wisengamot is, of course, diligent in its pursuit of justice." His pale eyes moved over Harry with the thoroughness of an assessment. "You've made quite the entrance into our world, Mr. Potter." "Quite the entrance." "Thank you," Harry said pleasantly. He held Malfoy's gaze without difficulty. You voted to close the Order of the Phoenix inquiry in 1981. The 4-7 vote. Something moved through Malfoy's face, so quickly controlled it was almost imperceptible, but Harry had been watching Vernon Dursley's face his entire life and had learned to catch small things fast. I was unaware you had access to. Gringotts keeps records of Governance Council votes, Harry said. Ragnarok's very thorough. He kept his voice light and informational, the way you described weather. I've been doing a lot of reading this week. The inquiry closure meant no formal investigation into how Voldemort came back to power, or who assisted him, or what happened to the network of people who'd supported him. He tilted his head slightly. Given that my parents are dead, I have kind of a personal interest in that particular piece of history. Malfoy was very still. As I said, Harry continued, I've been reading. It's very interesting, the Gringotts records. The level of detail. He smiled, not unkindly, just precisely. It was lovely to meet you, Mr. Malfoy. He turned and walked to the fireplace. Sirius caught up with him in 3 steps and bent slightly to say, very quietly, near his ear, do you have any idea who that is? Yes, Harry said. Ragnarok told me. And you just, I didn't accuse him of anything, Harry said. I mentioned publicly available records. He paused. To his face. In the Ministry atrium. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then, Moony. From behind them, Remus said, I heard. The 8-year-old just politically outmaneuvered Lucius Malfoy in the Ministry atrium. I'm aware. Using library records. Sirius. I'm just, contextualizing. I know. So is he. Remus came alongside them and looked at Harry with an expression that had moved well past the tired warmth category and into something else entirely. James and Lily would have, he stopped, did the thing he always did where he reached for the sentence and then pulled back from it. You can finish those, Harry said. When you're ready. I'd like to hear them. Remus looked at him. His jaw tightened very slightly. Then he said, they would have been completely insufferable about it. Both of them. James would have told the story at every available opportunity and Lily would have pretended to be embarrassed and she wouldn't have been at all. Harry smiled. A real one, the kind that came from somewhere uncomplicated. Okay, he said. Good. The fireplace deposited them into the leaky cauldron's back room at 4:30, and Tom appeared immediately with tea and something small to eat and the expression of a man running a very important relay and fully committed to his leg of it. Ragnarok was already at their corner table, which Harry had come to think of as there's the same way you come to think of things as yours when they're there every day and feel right. He had a folder open that was different from his usual folders, thinner, but sealed with a different kind of clasp, a silver one. Several things, he said, when they sat down, and Harry recognized the particular quality of Ragnarok. Several things that meant he'd been waiting to say these things and had arranged them in order of importance. First, the preliminary custody hearing is confirmed for Monday. Given the Wisengamot's review outcome and the family court proceedings today, the formal assignment of Sirius Black as Harry's guardian is expected to be straightforward. I want to be clear about expected, because simple things have a way of becoming complicated, Dumbledore, Harry said. He has filed a statement with the family court expressing concern about Mr. Black's current state following his imprisonment. Ragnarok paused. It is a careful document. It doesn't argue against the guardianship directly. It questions whether an adequate transition period has been observed. Sirius's jaw was tight. He's saying I'm not stable. He's carefully not saying it while implying it, Ragnarok corrected. There's a difference. What do we do about it? Harry asked. You demonstrate the opposite, Ragnarok said. The hearing will include an assessment by a certified healer, standard procedure for guardianship transfers where the guardian has experienced significant trauma. Mr. Black, I've arranged for you to meet with the healer tomorrow. Her name is Pomfrey, Poppy Pomfrey, she is, for what it's worth, someone who knew your family. He looked at Sirius. She's on our side. Sirius nodded slowly. Second thing, Ragnarok continued. The trial date for Mr. Black's formal exoneration has been moved up. New evidence has emerged, and I want Harry to hear this because it came through his family's records. He opened the thin silver-clasped folder. Peter Pettigrew was a registered animagus. An illegal one, unregistered, which is itself a crime but that's secondary. His animal form was a rat. Following the street explosion in 1981, the official record notes that a finger was recovered. That's all. No body. He looked around the table. Animagi can produce transformational residue. Certain types of spell forensics can identify whether a portion of what appeared to be explosive debris was in fact transformational material. The Auror office at the time did not run that test. We now can. The table was quiet. He faked his death, Harry said. Almost certainly. Which means he's alive. Likely, yes. Which means, Sirius said, and his voice had gone to a very specific quiet, that he's been out there for 7 years while I've been in Azkaban. Yes. The silence was a different texture now. Harry looked at Sirius and saw something moving behind the grey eyes that was not the grief compound of the medical facility but something more immediate and more dangerous. Not grief. Its cousin. Sirius, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. We do this properly, Harry said. All of it properly. You're not going back to Azkaban for anything. A pause. Something worked its way through Sirius's expression, the dangerous thing settling, not gone but contained, folded back. He breathed out once, slow. Yeah, he said. Properly. If Pettigrew's alive, Harry said to Ragnarok, who do we tell? Bones, Ragnarok said. Today. Which is why I have this. He closed the folder and slid it across the table to Harry. For her. With my compliments. Harry took it. The third thing, Ragnarok said, is better. He reached into his briefcase and produced a map, parchment, old, hand-drawn, with the particular quality of something that had been made with care rather than printed for distribution. He laid it on the table between them. It showed a region of rolling hills with a valley marked by a thin blue line that was a stream, and in the valley, indicated by a symbol that Harry recognized as the same overlapping P from the box clasp, a property. I believe, Ragnarok said, that this is Potter Manor. Harry looked at the map. The property in Shropshire, the one under the dissolved Fidelius. The one with the library of 2,000 texts. How did you find it? You gave me the location, Ragnarok said. Northwest. A valley with a stream. I cross-referenced it with the property records from James Potter's family archive, we have them in the vault, and found a match. The Fidelius dissolution hasn't made it visible to anyone who wasn't already aware of it. But it's made it findable by the correct heir. He looked at Harry. Which is you? Harry looked at the map for a long moment. The thin blue line of the stream. The P in the valley. Home, James Potter's magic had called it, built into the dissolving charm like a message in a bottle. Can we go? Harry asked. After the custody hearing Monday, Ragnarok said. Once guardianship is formally assigned, Mr. Black can accompany you as your legal guardian and I can accompany you as the estate representative. We go together, properly. A pause. It will keep. Harry looked at the map. He thought about the note, he's everything, and his father hiding documents in a compartment that only a Potter could open, in the house of Muggle relatives, because he was worried someone would interfere with it. Building failsafes into failsafes. Thinking of everything. He'd been 8 years old, in a cupboard under some stairs, with no one telling him any of this. And his father had sat down in October 1981, 3 weeks before he died, and written the clause and hidden the box and addressed the note to a man he trusted above everyone, and somewhere in that architecture, in the blood-activated seals and the dissolving Fidelius and the monitoring alert that had finally, 8 years late, done exactly what it was designed to do, was a kind of love that was different from anything Harry had a reference point for. Not the love of people who were there. The love of someone who'd known they might not be, and had built for the gap. Ragnarok, Harry said. Yes. Thank you, he said. Not just for this week. For the 6 years before it. For trying. Ragnarok looked at him with those amber eyes, steady and direct. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father made me a promise when he opened the estate account. He said, look after it. As if it were yours." He paused. "I have been trying to honor that promise. It took longer than it should have." Harry nodded. He looked back down at the map, at the stream and the valley and the pea in the hills. Monday, then. Outside the leaky cauldron's grimy windows, the London afternoon was going gold, the light thickening toward evening. Somewhere in Whitehall, Vernon Dursley's solicitor was reviewing the day's testimony and finding it as workable as wet toast. Somewhere in the ministry, Lucius Malfoy was thinking about publicly available records and a boy who had looked at him without blinking. Somewhere in Dumbledore's office, a man was writing another careful, considered, thoroughly insufficient document. And in the corner table of a slightly crooked pub on Charing Cross Road, an 8-year-old boy, a free man, and a tired professor sat together over a map of a house none of them had seen yet, and the evening pressed in warm and gold and entirely possible. Chapter 5. The Potter's Seat. Monday arrived with actual sunshine, which Harry noted felt appropriate without being sentimental about it. He was up at 7, dressed in proper robes, not the plain ones from his first day at the ministry but a set Sirius had insisted on acquiring from a tailor in Diagon Alley 2 days earlier, dark green with clean lines, the Potter crest worked into the collar in a way that was present but not loud. Sirius had stood in the tailor's shop with his arms folded and said things like, "Not that one, too formal," and, "Yes, that's right," with the focused certainty of a man who had grown up in a house that had its own opinions about presentation and had decided to have opinions about it now too, and Harry had let him because Sirius needed to do things for him and this was a good thing to do. The robes fit. That was still remarkable. He ate breakfast properly, Tom's full spread, eggs and toast and the good tea, and Sirius sat across from him eating with his usual focused attention and reading a copy of the Daily Prophet that he kept folding and refolding as though it were personally responsible for things he disagreed with. "They've done another piece on the hearing," Sirius said. "What kind of piece?" "The kind that's mostly accurate but has this," he turned a page, "this particular quality of surprise in it. Like they can't quite get over the fact that a child sat in a hearing and made sense." "What did they expect?" "I think they expected you to be," Sirius considered, "more of a symbol and less of a person." Harry poured more tea. "How's the coverage on Vernon?" "Front page yesterday. Buried on 6 today." Sirius set the paper down. "His solicitor has been talking to the press. The line is that the wizarding world imposed an impossible situation on a Muggle family without proper support." "There's some truth in that," Remus said, appearing from the staircase with his own cup in hand and a book under his arm. He sat down and looked at Harry. "Not regarding Vernon specifically. But Dumbledore placing a magical child with Muggle relatives without any coordination, support framework, or follow-up, that created conditions for exactly this kind of failure. The Muggle family was given nothing. No explanation, no resources, no contact. He left a letter," Harry said. "I've read Petunia's testimony about the letter," Remus said. It explained what Harry was and that he needed to stay for the blood wards. It didn't include a contact number, an emergency procedure, a financial arrangement, or anything that resembled a support plan. Because if he'd set up a financial arrangement, Sirius said, flatly, someone would have had to contact Gringotts. Gringotts would have flagged the estate management. Ragnarok would have asked questions. The table went quiet. Harry said nothing because there was nothing to add. They'd been circling this particular shape for a week, the thing that kept emerging when you pulled the threads, the pattern in the decisions. Each one individually defensible, collectively pointing somewhere deliberate. I'm not saying he meant for you to be hurt, Remus said carefully. I'm saying the structure he built made it likely, and he either didn't think it through or he did and considered it acceptable. Either way, Harry said, it was his choice. He finished his tea. The family court at 9 in the morning had a different atmosphere from the combined hearing of last week. Smaller group, lower stakes in the theatrical sense, no Hartley, no joint bench, no Vernon sitting pink and aggrieved across a table. Just Magistrate Whitmore, the same one who'd signed the original detainment warrant, a calm-faced wizard in his 50s with a neat grey beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had been managing family cases for long enough to have seen everything and maintained his equilibrium accordingly. Harry sat beside Ragnarok. Sirius sat on his other side. Bones and the civil rights advocate Pruitt were arranged along the wall. Dumbledore's representative, not Dumbledore himself, a careful absence Harry noted, was a ministry liaison named Croaker who had the look of a man who knew his brief was thin and was hoping deportment would compensate. Pomfrey's assessment of Sirius had been submitted the previous day. Harry hadn't read it because it wasn't his document to read, but Sirius had told him what it said in the kitchen that morning: physically depleted but recovering, psychologically resilient, demonstrates clear and consistent caregiving instincts, no contraindications for guardianship. He'd said it in a very flat, matter-of-fact voice while looking at the table, which Harry had translated correctly as meaning he was trying not to feel things about Pomfrey calling him resilient. Whitmore called the hearing to order, reviewed the submitted documentation, asked Sirius 3 questions directly, about Harry's current living situation, about his own situation, about his understanding of his responsibilities going forward, and then looked at Croaker. The ministry liaison wished to include a statement, Whitmore said. Croaker stood, smoothed his robes, and read from a prepared document in the voice of a man reading someone else's words and keeping as much distance from them as possible. The statement expressed the ministry's hope that adequate time be taken to ensure the stability of the guardianship transition, given the extraordinary circumstances of Mr. Black's recent release, and respectfully suggested a period of supervised guardianship before full assignment. Supervised by whom? Whitmore asked. Croaker checked his document. The ministry would provide. The ministry, Ragnarok said, with exceptional precision, had nominal oversight of this child's welfare for 7 years and produced no supervisory action of any kind during that period. I would suggest that the ministry's supervisory credentials in this matter are not, at present, strong. Croaker looked at his document, found nothing useful in it, and sat down. Whitmore looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, do you wish to say anything before I rule? Harry had thought about this. He'd thought about it yesterday, walking along Diagon Alley while Sirius pointed out which shops were which and occasionally stopped to look at things with the expression of someone recalibrating the world's continued existence. He'd thought about what Whitmore would need to hear versus what Harry wanted to say, and had decided that on this particular occasion they were the same thing. Sirius Black is my godfather, Harry said. He was my father's best friend. My parents trusted him with me specifically because they knew what kind of person he was. 7 years of wrongful imprisonment didn't change who he is, it changed what he's been through. Those are different things. He paused. I know who I want for a guardian. I've known since I read the clause. I think I knew before that, actually, even though I didn't have the words for it. Whitmore looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something on his document, looked at it, and said, guardianship is assigned to Sirius Orion Black, formally and unconditionally, effective immediately, pending no restrictions. He set his quill down. Mr. Black, I trust you understand the weight of this. Yes, Sirius said. His voice was even. Then we're finished. It was the most efficient thing that had happened all week, and it took approximately 11 minutes. In the corridor afterward, Sirius stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the wall for a moment. Remus stood beside him and also looked at the wall. Harry stood with them and looked at the wall too, because sometimes that was the correct activity. Then Sirius said, right then. Right then, Harry agreed. Right, Remus said, meaning several other things with it. Ragnarok appeared from the courtroom door and said, "The car is waiting. We should go to Shropshire before the afternoon weather turns." The drive northwest took 2 hours, which gave Harry time to watch the city thin out into suburbs and then into countryside, actual countryside, green and rolling, nothing like the tidy suburban geometry of Privet Drive. He'd barely been outside Surrey in his life. The sheer scale of land surprised him, all these hills folded into each other without visible end. Sirius sat beside him in the back of the Gringotts car and pointed things out with the proprietary knowledge of someone who had driven these roads before, a long time ago. That village, the pub with the blue door, he and James had stopped there once. Those hills in the distance, the far edge of Wales. He talked in the easy, somewhat rambling way he'd found in the past few days, filling space that had been empty for too long, and Harry listened and watched the countryside and felt the thing in his chest that was tentatively joy doing something steadier and less tentative. Ragnarok sat in the front with the driver, reviewing documents, occasionally making notes. Remus had taken a separate car with the Gringotts legal team who were coming to formally witness the heir's assumption of the property. The car turned off the main road onto a lane that narrowed steadily, hedges pressing close on either side, and then the lane dipped down into a valley and Harry felt it before he saw it. The same reach-inward sensation as in Ragnarok's office. The warm room from the cold feeling. But stronger now, more specific, not distant like standing outside a field but immediate, like the field had come to meet him. His hands felt warm. "There," he said. The car rounded a curve in the lane and there was a gate, iron, old, worked with the P design, standing open. Beyond the gate, a drive lined with very old trees, their roots lifting the gravel in long patient heaves, and at the end of the drive, in a cup of the valley with the stream running silver beyond it, a house. Not a manor in the intimidating sense. Not towers and battlements. A large stone house with a slate roof and many windows and the specific quality of something that had been built to be lived in rather than to be impressive, that had been added to over centuries by people who needed another room or a better kitchen or a library wing and had simply built what they needed without asking whether it was architecturally coherent. It was not architecturally coherent. It was entirely wonderful. Harry was out of the car before the driver had properly stopped, which he acknowledged was undignified and didn't care about at all. He walked up the drive and the magic of the place came up to meet him with every step, not aggressive, not testing, just recognizing, the way a dog recognizes its own household by smell. The stones of the path knew his blood. The gate had opened without being asked. And when he reached the front door, heavy oak with iron fittings and a handle worn smooth by centuries of hands, it opened before he touched it. He stepped in. The entrance hall smelled of old wood and stone and something dusty in a good way, the dust of books rather than neglect. There were paintings on the walls, moving paintings, wizarding ones, and the figures in them straightened and turned and looked at him with an attentiveness that said they knew exactly who he was and had been waiting. "Welcome home," said the woman in the largest painting, directly across from the door. She was middle-aged and sharp-eyed with the Potter coloring, dark hair, strong features, and she said it not like a formula but like a fact, like she'd been holding it ready for a specific moment. "We were beginning to wonder." "Sorry," Harry said. "I got held up." Sirius came in behind him, looked at the hall, looked at the paintings, and made a sound that was not entirely composed. "I've been here," he said, quietly. "Before. When we were students. I came here for Christmas once." He stopped. "It looks exactly the same." "Things that are properly built tend to," Ragnarok said, coming in behind him with his briefcase and the immediate businesslike air of a man who was going to appreciate the sentiment briefly and then do his job. They went through the house in a loose group, Ragnarok with his inventory checklist, Sirius moving through rooms and occasionally stopping as though he'd walked into something invisible, Remus quiet and careful as always, Harry absorbing everything. The kitchen was large and warm and had clearly been maintained by household charms that had continued running in the absence of occupants. The sitting room had windows looking out over the stream. There was a room that appeared to be a study, James Potter's study, still with papers on the desk in that fast slanted handwriting, as though he'd just stepped out. Sirius stood in the doorway of that room and didn't go in. Harry stood beside him. "You don't have to," Harry said. "I know." A pause. "Give me a day." "Obviously." Then Harry found the library. It was in the East Wing, accessed through a door that required his handprint on a warded panel, his specifically, the magic checking his bloodline with a faint warm pulse before allowing the door to swing inward. Beyond it was a room that went up 2 floors, lined entirely with shelves, a rolling ladder on a rail, a reading table in the center, and windows that let in the afternoon light at precisely the right angle. The books themselves were in excellent condition, preserved by charms, organized by a system that Harry immediately identified as being both idiosyncratic and highly logical, the organizational system of someone who had known exactly where everything was and expected future occupants to learn it. He ran his hand along a shelf and felt the titles speaking to him in some subtactile way, not literally, just the sense of volume and subject and age. Potions Theory. Transfiguration History. Advanced Charm Work. And behind a glass panel in the center section, older volumes, genuinely old, pre-ministry old, the leather dark and the spines hand-lettered in inks that had turned various shades of sepia. One of them, on the top shelf of the glass section, was titled The Families of Britain, Magical Lineage and Estate Law, 4th edition. Harry stared at it for a moment, then got the rolling ladder and went up. He brought it down to the reading table and opened it. It was, as Ragnarok had promised, genuinely interesting. They stayed until evening. Ragnarok completed the estate inventory, confirmed the property's condition, formally registered Harry's assumption of the property in the Gringotts records with a signed document that Harry understood, by now, how to read and what it meant. The house was his. Unambiguously, legally, entirely his. The legal team departed with the car at 5, Ragnarok included. He shook Harry's hand before leaving and held it for a moment and said, "I have a further 47 questions, but they will keep until tomorrow," which was his version of, "This was a good day." Harry, Sirius, and Remus stayed. They ate in the kitchen from the provisions they'd brought. Sirius had packed things in a bag at the Leaky Cauldron that morning with the focused energy of someone who had decided that the first meal in the house was going to be a real one, and he cooked with a surprising confidence that Harry filed away as a thing to ask about later. Remus set the table and found wine in a rack in the cellar and opened it and poured 2 glasses with the easy domestic fluency of someone who had shared space with other people before and remembered how. They sat around a kitchen table, the big one, with 8 chairs, too many chairs for 3 people, the perfect number of chairs for a house that was supposed to have people in it again, and ate, and talked, and the evening outside the windows went from gold to purple to proper dark, the stream invisible now but audible, its sound coming through a window someone had opened. "You'll need to go to Hogwarts," Remus said, after a while. 3 years, Harry said. "I'm 8. You'll need to start somewhere before Hogwarts. Your reading level is already well beyond primary standard, but the magical theory is entirely absent. You've had a week of Ragnarok explaining estate law, which is not a substitute. There are tutors," Sirius said. "Private tutors for pure-blood kids who don't go to primary magical schools. It's a whole system." "I know," Harry said. "I read about it in the family's book upstairs." He paused. "I'd like to do that. The tutors. But I want to choose them." Sirius looked at him. "How do you mean?" "I've spent a week reading about who knows what in the wizarding world," Harry said. "Ragnarok knows magical law. Pomfrey knows healing. Bones knows," he stopped. "I'd like to ask them. The people I've already met who are, good at things and not," he searched for the word. "Not invested in telling you a particular story," Remus said quietly. "Yeah." Sirius leaned back in his chair and looked at Harry with those gray eyes. "You know," he said, "normal children don't network." "I'm told I'm unusual for my age," Harry said. Repeatedly, Remus confirmed. Sirius grinned, a real one, the wide unguarded kind that was starting to come more frequently, the one that was clearly the descendant of the careless grin in the Auror photograph even if it had been rebuilt from different material. Ragnarok will be insufferably pleased. He likes people who treat it as a proper job. It is a proper job, Harry said. I have an estate to run. You're 8. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. It also keeps being irrelevant, Harry said, and Remus laughed, a real laugh, warm and a little startled, which Harry had learned was the most Remus laugh there was. They cleared up together, the three of them moving around the kitchen in the easy, slightly tentative choreography of people learning each other's rhythms, and then they went through to the sitting room and sat by the windows where the fire that had apparently just lit itself. Household charms, Sirius explained, the house takes care of itself when there are Potters in it, made the room warm and orange. Harry sat in an armchair that felt like it had been waiting for him, the right size, the right depth, positioned perfectly relative to the fire. He thought that was probably the household charms again, or possibly he was reading into furniture, and decided it didn't matter which. He picked up the lineage book and read. Sirius sat across from him and read a newspaper he'd brought. Remus sat beside the fire with his own book. The stream ran outside in the dark. After about an hour, Harry said, Ragnarok mentioned the Potter's seat on the Wizarding Governance Council. Sirius looked up. The family seat. It's been dormant since my father died. But it's still there, the seat doesn't go away, it waits for the head of the family. Harry looked at him. I can't formally assume the headship until I'm 11. But there's a provision in the governance charter, I found it in here, he held up the lineage book, for a minor to appoint a seat proxy. Someone to hold the seat in formal sessions until the heir comes of age. Sirius was quiet for a moment. You're thinking about the council. I'm thinking about Malfoy, Harry said. And the other 6 who voted to close the order inquiry. The council makes decisions about things like ministry oversight, investigative commissions, estate law amendments. He paused. If Pettigrew is alive and we need support for Sirius's trial, having a voice in the council would, Harry, Sirius said. Harry looked at him. You're 8 years old and you've been in the wizarding world for 9 days, Sirius said. His voice was not alarmed, just careful. Making sure something was being said. Some of what you're thinking about is correct strategy. Some of it you're building too fast because you've had to manage everything yourself your entire life and it's very hard to stop. Harry held his gaze. Then he said, both things are true. Yeah, Sirius said. Both things are true. A pause. The proxy vote, Remus said, from beside the fire, in the tone of someone who had been listening carefully and had decided to be useful. Who would you name? Harry looked at Ragnarok's folder on the side table, he'd brought it from the car, because of course he had. He opened it to the section on the Governance Council. The proxy provision required the appointment to be a witch or wizard of legal age with no outstanding criminal charges, no current ministry employment, which excluded Bones, unfortunately, and no conflict of interest with the Potter estate. He looked at the list of names in his head. The people he'd met in 9 days who were good and trustworthy and capable. He looked across at Sirius. You, he said. Sirius stared at him. Your trial isn't until next month. You have no current charges, the imprisonment was declared invalid, which means it's as though it never happened, technically, for the purposes of record, Remus said slowly. Under Statute 14. Yes. You knew my father. You know the political landscape. You know who Malfoy is and what he does and, Harry paused. And you're my guardian. The council would have to take you seriously. They can't ignore the Potter proxy guardian. Sirius had gone very still. Not the bad stillness of the medical facility. A different kind, the stillness of someone processing something enormous that they hadn't been prepared for. Harry, he said. I've been out of Azkaban for less than 2 weeks. I know. The council, you don't have to decide tonight, Harry said. I'm not trying to draft you into anything. I just want you to know it's an option. He looked at him steadily. You were an auror. You were good at it. Ragnar's file on you says your instincts were almost irritatingly good. He let that land. Azkaban took 7 years. I don't think it took that. Another long silence. The fire moved in its grate. Outside, the stream ran in the dark with its constant, unhurried sound. Let me talk to Ragnar, Sirius said finally. And think about it. Good, Harry said. He went back to the lineage book. Sirius looked at him for a moment with an expression that had too many layers to unpick quickly, something that was pride and grief and wonder and the specific feeling of being trusted by someone whose trust meant everything, all of it moving under the surface like weather. Then he went back to his newspaper. Remus, by the fire, said nothing. He turned a page of his book. He was almost certainly not reading it. The next morning Harry was up before either of them, which turned out to be an easy habit in a house where the kitchen light came on by itself and the kettle was warm before you reached it. He sat at the kitchen table with tea and the lineage book and the Gringotts folder and the morning coming in through the eastern windows, and he read, and thought, and wrote notes in a small notebook he'd bought in Diagon Alley, his own handwriting, different from his father's, smaller and neater, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to write small because paper was a limited resource. At 8:30 an owl arrived with a letter from Bones. Preliminary finding from the family court, Vernon Dursley found to have a case to answer on all charges, muggle and wizarding. Full sentencing hearing scheduled in 3 weeks. His solicitor has lodged an appeal against the joint bench procedure, which will go nowhere but will delay things. Standard. Also, the forensic team completed the animagus residue analysis on the 1981 explosion debris. Positive result. Pettigrew was at that scene. Pettigrew transformed. I am now officially treating this as an active case, not historical documentation. Stay available. Bones. Harry read it twice. Then he put it on the table beside his notebook. Peter Pettigrew was alive. That was now forensically confirmed. Which meant he was somewhere, had been somewhere for 7 years, had let Sirius rot in Azkaban while he, was what? Living as what? An unregistered animagus could theoretically live as an animal indefinitely. A rat, Ragnar had said. A rat could live anywhere. Harry thought about that. He thought about it with the same cold patience he'd brought to Vernon's trial, the same clear-eyed assessment he'd applied to Malfoy in the Ministry atrium. He had a confirmed living witness who could exonerate Sirius completely. He had an assessor who was now actively pursuing the case. He had a trial date in 4 weeks that needed that witness present. Pettigrew had to be found. Sirius came down at 9 looking like someone who had slept, actually slept, deeply and properly, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're somewhere your body has decided is safe. He poured tea, sat down, looked at the letter from Bones. He read it without expression. Then he set it down. He's been a rat, Sirius said. That's my guess, Harry said. Living as someone's pet, maybe. Or wild. He was quiet. He always took the path of least resistance. He'd have found somewhere safe and comfortable. His voice was very flat. Somewhere no one would look for him. Bones is looking for him now, Harry said. I want to help, Sirius said. The flatness in his voice had a direction to it now. I know Peter. I know how he thinks, how he hides, what frightens him. I can tell Bones, Harry said. All of it. Everything you know. She's good and she needs what you have. Sirius looked at him. You're not going to argue about whether I should be involved. It's your case, Harry said simply. Your life. I'm 8. Sirius made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the vicinity. He put his hand over his face for a moment, and when he took it away his expression was cleaner, like something had been resolved in it. Right, he said. I'll contact Bones today. Remus came in during this exchange, assessed the room, read the letter when Sirius pushed it toward him, and said, "The rat," in a very quiet voice with a very specific quality that made Harry think there was more history there than he currently had context for. Later, Sirius said to Remus. Remus looked at him. Something moved between them, the communication of people who had known each other a very long time, the compressed language of shared history. He nodded once. After breakfast the three of them walked down to the stream. It was bright and cold, the valley holding the morning quiet, the stream running fast and clear over pale stones. Harry walked along the bank with his hands in his pockets and the household magic warm at his back, literally warm. The house seemed to know when you were near it and pushed a gentle ambient temperature toward you like a greeting. "I want to ask you something," Harry said, to both of them. They walked. "Stay," he said. "Both of you. Here. I know there's the trial and Pettigrew and the council proxy question and all of it. But this is the house. It's big enough." He paused. "I don't want to live here alone, and I don't want to go back to the leaky cauldron now that I have this." A silence that was not uncomfortable. "Sirius is your guardian," Remus said carefully. "He'll stay, I'm asking you to," Harry said. Remus looked at the stream. "I should have been there for you," he said, in a voice that was doing significant structural work to stay even. "After Lily and James, I should have fought. I should have asked questions, gone to Gringotts, checked. I knew about the clause, James told me about it when he drafted it, he told both of us, and he stopped. I was so broken I couldn't, I let it go. I told myself Dumbledore knew best and I let it go." "You didn't know about Sirius," Harry said. "I thought he'd done it. I thought," Remus pressed his mouth together. "I was wrong. About one of my oldest friends. And while I was wrong about that, you were." "I'm not looking for an apology," Harry said. "I'm asking you to stay." Remus looked at him. The tiredness in his face was still there, but beneath it something else was visible, not quite hope, something more considered than hope, the expression of a man who had arrived at a door he hadn't been sure he was allowed to knock on and was finding it already open. "All right," he said quietly. "Yes." Sirius was already nodding, had been since Harry first said stay, with the nod of a man who had decided before the question finished that the answer was yes. The three of them stood by the stream in the morning light of the valley, and the house at their backs was warm and solid and present, and the P above its door was cut into stone that had been there for 3 centuries and was prepared to be there for 3 more. Harry picked up a stone from the bank and threw it into the stream, which was a completely purposeless act that felt exactly right. Sirius immediately found a better stone and threw it further. Remus said, "We're 800 years old between us," and threw his stone even further than Sirius's, which prompted Sirius to make a highly indignant noise and search for a flatter stone with the focus of a man who had decided this was important. Harry laughed. A full laugh, unguarded, the kind that came from somewhere that had been waiting a long time for permission. It was a good sound in that valley. The house, for what it was worth, seemed to agree. A letter arrived at 4 that afternoon from a ministry address Harry didn't recognize. Not Bones's handwriting, smaller, more careful, the writing of someone who had thought about each word before committing it. He opened it at the kitchen table while Sirius and Remus argued cheerfully about whether the sitting room's bookshelves were organized according to any discernible principle. The letter was from a senior undersecretary named Dolores Umbridge, office of the minister, and it expressed, in language that managed to be simultaneously warm and deeply threatening in a way Harry found technically impressive, the ministry's view that a minor of Harry's age and circumstances would benefit enormously from the guiding oversight of the Department of Magical Education, and enclosed a formal proposal for Harry's placement in the ministry's supervised magical development program. Which was, as far as Harry could tell from reading it twice, a program that didn't currently exist. He put the letter down. He picked up his notebook and wrote, "Umbridge, find out who she talks to and what she reports to. Then, ministry wants oversight." Why now? What does oversight mean practically? Who benefits? He looked at the notes. He thought about the shape of it, the pattern in the decisions again, the thing that kept emerging. The Ministry's instinct, when faced with Harry Potter, was to find a mechanism for control dressed up as care. Dumbledore's instinct had been the same. Vernon's had been cruder but structurally identical. Harry was not going to be supervised by someone who had invented the supervising program yesterday. He wrote Bones's name in the notebook. Then Ragnar's. Then, after a moment, he wrote proxy vote and underlined it. There was a governance council session in 6 weeks. The Potter seat hadn't been occupied in 7 years. If Sirius agreed to the proxy, and Harry thought, watching him through the kitchen door as he triumphantly reorganized a shelf while Remus argued about it, if Sirius agreed, the seat would be occupied next session. And whoever was writing letters like Umbridge's, whoever was thinking about oversight programs for a boy they hadn't met, whoever was uncomfortable with the events of the past 10 days, they would find that the Potter seat had an opinion. Harry closed his notebook. The stream ran outside in the cooling afternoon. The household charms were warming the kitchen. Upstairs, the library held 2,000 books and a family's worth of accumulated thought, waiting to be read. He had, by his own estimate, approximately 3 years before Hogwarts. 3 years was a long time, properly used. Chapter 6, A New Address. 3 weeks had a way of moving fast when you were busy, and Harry Potter had been extremely busy. He had read, in order of acquisition, the complete lineage book, 2 volumes on wizarding estate law, 1 volume on governance council procedure that was dry enough to sand furniture with but contained 3 specific provisions Harry had underlined and flagged, all of James Potter's research notes from the study upstairs, which he had finally gone into on day 4, alone, quietly, and stayed in for 2 hours reading in the chair behind the desk while the afternoon light moved across the walls. And a significant portion of a text on foundational magical theory that Ragnar had sent over via owl with a note saying you'll need this before the tutors start. The tutors were starting next week. Harry had, as promised, chosen them himself, which had involved 3 conversations with Ragnar, 2 owls to Bones, and 1 dinner at the kitchen table with Sirius and Remus that had turned into a 4-hour discussion about magical education theory and what it was and wasn't good for. The final list was 4 people. A retired charms professor named Flitwick who Remus had recommended with the careful enthusiasm of someone trying not to gush, a potions practitioner from St. Mungo's named Greengrass who Ragnar had suggested on the grounds that she was technically brilliant and had no ministry affiliations, a magical history scholar named Marchbanks who was 87, entirely formidable, and had apparently examined James Potter at his OWLs and remembered it clearly, and Remus himself, for defense against the dark arts, which Sirius had proposed and Remus had argued against on the grounds that he wasn't qualified and Sirius had pointed out that he was the most qualified person available and the argument had resolved itself through attrition. So that was settled. The Umbridge letter had received a response drafted by Harry, reviewed by Bones, and sent under the Potter family seal. It thanked the Undersecretary for her interest and noted that Harry's educational arrangements were being handled through the established framework for minor magical heirs, coordinated through Gringotts, and did not require supplementary ministry programming. It was 3 sentences long. Bones had described it as perfectly calibrated, which Harry took to mean it was polite enough to be unanswerable and clear enough to leave no room for the follow-up. There had been no follow-up. Sirius had agreed to the proxy vote on day 7. He'd told Harry over breakfast with the directness of someone who had finished thinking and arrived at a decision. I talked to Ragnar. I talked to Bones. I read the council charter. He'd paused, turning his mug in his hands. Your father held that seat from the time he turned 17 until he died. He used it the same way you're describing, not loudly, not for show, but as a lever. You put a lever in the right place, you can move things that shouldn't be movable. He'd looked at Harry. So yes. I'll hold it. Harry had said, good, and passed him the toast. The proxy registration had been filed with the council on day 9. The confirmation had come back the same afternoon. Ragnar had sent a brief note, confirmed. Session in 4 weeks. I expect someone will have opinions about this. I look forward to their opinions. Which was the most openly anticipatory Harry had ever seen him. All of which meant that by the morning of Vernon Dursley's sentencing hearing, Potter Manor had been occupied for 21 days, Harry's life had changed so comprehensively that the cupboard under the stairs at Privet Drive felt like something that had happened to a different person, and Harry was in the kitchen at 7 making tea when Sirius came down and said, "You don't have to go today." Harry looked at him. "I know. You've already testified. The finding is already in. They don't need you there for the sentencing." "I know," Harry said again. He poured the second cup and handed it across. "I want to go." Sirius took the cup and said nothing else. That was one of the things about Sirius that Harry had come to understand and appreciate. He said the thing once. He made sure you knew the option existed. And then he let you make your choice without argument, because he'd grown up in a house where choices were argued down or overridden, and he'd decided some time ago that he was going to be the kind of person who didn't do that. Harry knew this the way he knew most things about Sirius, not because Sirius had explained it, but because he watched and he understood what he saw. Remus came down at 7:30 with his coat already on, which answered the question of whether he was coming without it needing to be asked. The combined court was more full today than it had been for Harry's testimony. Word had gotten around, not in the wizarding press particularly, which was more interested in the black exoneration angle, but in the quieter way that legal proceedings gather attention when they have multiple layers of implication. 3 rows of public gallery were occupied, a mix of witches, wizards, and Muggle court observers, the latter looking slightly disoriented by the joint bench and the presence of 2 people in the gallery who were quite tall and had distinctly non-Muggle quality robes. Harry sat in the front of the gallery with Sirius on one side and Remus on the other and watched the proceedings with the same calm attention he brought to everything. Vernon was there, in the same suit, with Hartley beside him. He'd lost weight since Privet Drive. Harry noticed this and noted it and put it aside. Not guilt. Just observation. Hartley made a final argument for mitigation. He covered the familiar ground, the impossible situation, the lack of support, the cultural dissonance, the good faith. He was professional and he was thorough and he ran out of runway in about 12 minutes. Then Flint read the findings. On the wizarding charges, knowing suppression of a magical ward's identity and estate rights, interference with a guardian clause instrument, guilty on both counts. On the Muggle charges, child cruelty, willful neglect, failure of duty of care, guilty on all 3. The sentencing was structured in 2 parts. The wizarding penalty was a financial one, restitution to the Potter estate of an amount calculated to reflect the material disadvantage caused to Harry over 7 years, which Ragnarok had quantified with what Harry suspected was considerable relish, and a formal caution on the wizarding criminal register, which meant that Vernon Dursley's name would exist in ministry records as someone who had knowingly harmed a magical ward. The Muggle penalty was more significant. Community supervision, mandatory rehabilitation program, a formal criminal record, and a custodial sentence of 18 months suspended on the condition of full compliance with the supervision terms. Hartley had managed the expectations well. Vernon didn't react visibly. Just sat with that tired, pink, diminished quality and nodded when Flint asked if he understood the terms. Then Davies looked up from her papers and addressed the room rather than specifically Vernon. "I want to say something that is not strictly part of the formal record," she said, "but which I think needs to be said in this room." She paused. A child was failed by multiple systems simultaneously. His legal entitlements were not communicated to him. His welfare was not adequately monitored. The adults who were supposed to protect him either didn't know or chose not to look. She looked at Vernon, then out at the gallery. This case should not be understood as the story of one man's cruelty. It should be understood as what happens when the institutions responsible for protecting children assume that someone else is doing it. No one was doing it. She returned to her papers. "We are adjourned." The room stood. Harry stood with everyone else and looked at the bench and felt the full weight of what had just been formally established, the thing that had been true his entire life, said aloud in a court, written into a record. He felt, mostly, very tired. And under the tiredness, quiet. The quiet of something finished. Sirius put his hand on Harry's shoulder, the careful deliberate touch he developed over 3 weeks into something more natural, less tentative. Harry didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They filed out. In the corridor, Petunia was there. Harry hadn't expected that. She was standing near the corridor wall in a beige coat, thinner and more angular than usual, her face doing the thing it had always done, the controlled, compressed expression of someone who considered visible emotion a form of weakness. She looked at Harry and Harry looked at her. Sirius tensed beside him. Remus went very still. Harry held up one hand, a small gesture, just enough, and they held back. He walked over to her. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in a voice stripped of its usual primness, "You look well." "I am," he said. "The house, the manor." She stopped. "Tried again." "You're settled." "Yes." She looked at him with Lily Evans's eyes, blue rather than green, but the same shape, the same deep-set quality, and something moved through her expression that had too many years of suppression on it to be easily identified. It wasn't love. Harry had known for a long time that Petunia didn't love him, and had arrived at a place where that was simply true without being devastating. But it was something, some distant cousin of love, some trace of the person she might have been if she hadn't decided that everything she couldn't understand was something to be afraid of. She would have wanted, Petunia started, and then stopped immediately, as though the sentence had surprised her by starting. "I know," Harry said. Because he did. He'd been reading his mother's notes for 3 weeks, had found them in a folder in the library, research notes, letters, a few pages of what appeared to be a personal journal. He knew who Lily Evans had been, in outline. He knew she and Petunia had been sisters before they'd been strangers. "I didn't," Petunia said. "I wasn't, the way things were was not," she stopped again. 3 false starts, 3 retreats. She was trying to say something that required a vocabulary she hadn't built. Harry waited. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Clipped, minimal, like it had been extracted rather than offered. "But there." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the cupboard. The camp bed. The springs that squealed. He thought about what Remus had said, the impossibility of the situation, the lack of support, the cultural dissonance, and he thought about all the ways that was true and all the ways it was insufficient. "I hear you," he said. "Not it's okay. Not I forgive you. Not the script she might have hoped for or the condemnation she probably expected. Just the acknowledgement that she had spoken and he had been present for it." She nodded once, tightly, and looked away. Harry turned and walked back to Sirius and Remus. Neither of them said anything. They walked out of the ministry together into the grey London afternoon, and Sirius hailed the Gringotts car, and they got in, and the city moved past the windows in its usual, indifferent way. After a few minutes Remus said, quietly, that was remarkable." "She's still afraid of everything she doesn't understand," Harry said. "She has been her whole life." "That's not," he paused. "I don't forgive her. But I understand her. Those aren't the same thing." "No," Remus said. "They're not." Sirius was looking out the window. When he turned back, his expression was something private and settled. He said nothing, but reached over and briefly ruffled Harry's hair, an entirely undignified gesture that Harry endured with the dignity of someone accepting the spirit in which it was intended. "Your hair is already terrible," Sirius said. "I don't know why I keep doing that." "Habit?" Harry suggested. "Your father had the same hair. I did it to him for 7 years. He paused. He hated it too." "I don't hate it," Harry said. Sirius grinned. The drive back to Shropshire took the usual 2 hours, which Harry spent reading Ragnar's brief on the upcoming council session and which Sirius spent napping against the window with the uncomplicated capacity for sleep that Harry had noticed was one of the first things that had come back as the weeks passed, as though Sirius's body, once it understood it was safe, had immediately begun recovering with aggressive thoroughness. Remus read. Of course he did. Potter Manor received them as it always did, the gate opening, the drive lined with late autumn trees, the household warmth stepping out to meet them before they reached the door. Harry had stopped thinking about this as remarkable and had started thinking about it as home, which was, he recognized, the most significant thing that had happened in 21 days, and he was not going to make a production of it. There was an owl waiting on the post at the entrance. 2 owls, actually. One from Ragnarok, he recognized the Gringotts seal, and one in an envelope he didn't recognize, cream paper with handwriting that was careful and forward-slanted and vaguely familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. He took them both inside. Ragnarok's first. A brief note, typically efficient, Sirius Black's formal trial confirmed for 2 weeks from today. Forensic evidence submitted to the Wisengamot. Bones will prosecute. Pettigrew situation developing, see attached. The attached was a report from the Auror office, clearly written by Bones, noting that a search had been initiated for Peter Pettigrew using Animagus tracking charms. The tracking had returned a hit, not a location, but a confirmation of existence. Peter Pettigrew was alive. The charms had found traces of an unregistered Animagus transformation consistent with rat form in an area of southern England within the last 30 days. He was alive and he was recent. Harry put the report on the kitchen table and opened the second letter. Dear Harry, I am aware that a letter from me at this juncture is perhaps the last thing you wish to receive, and I have no expectation that you will receive it warmly. I write nonetheless, because I have come to understand that the alternative, continued silence, is simply another form of the error I have already made. I want to explain, not to justify. There is a difference, as I suspect you know better than I gave you credit for. When I placed you with your aunt, I believed I was making the only decision available to me. The blood ward protection was real and it was necessary, and I was afraid, more afraid than I have ever been in my life, that Voldemort's followers would find you if I placed you anywhere more visible. I chose the protection of Lily's sacrifice over everything else, including your comfort, your welfare, and your knowledge of yourself. I told myself that children are resilient. That 7 years was not so long. That the ends justified the means. I was wrong. Not in my understanding of the magic, the blood ward was real. But in my understanding of what I was asking you to endure, and in my certainty that I had the right to ask it. I did not tell you about Sirius because I believed him guilty. I was wrong about that too. The speed of his arrest, the absence of investigation, I accepted the surface of it because it was convenient to do so, and because grief makes us reach for simple explanations. That is not an excuse. It is an accounting. I am not asking for your forgiveness, Harry. I am asking for, eventually, the opportunity to be something more useful to you than an obstacle. Albus Dumbledore. Harry read it twice. He set it down on the kitchen table beside Ragnarok's report and sat for a moment with both of them. Sirius came in, read the room, read the letters, Harry pushed them over without comment, and read both without speaking. His expression went through several things on the Dumbledore letter. He set it down and said, "What do you think?" "I think he means it," Harry said. "I think he's completely genuine and completely certain he was right up until the moment he decided he wasn't, and the fact that he can change his assessment of himself is probably the most encouraging thing about him. But the thing he did isn't fixed by him understanding it differently." Harry looked at the letter. He said the ends justified the means. That's the structure of his thinking. He does the calculation, he decides what outcome is necessary, and then he arranges the world to produce that outcome. He's been doing it for decades. One letter doesn't undo the architecture. Sirius was quiet. He's still doing it, probably, Harry continued. Right now. Deciding what the best outcome is and figuring out how to arrange things. The letter is part of an arrangement. He paused. That doesn't mean it's not genuine. It means it's both. Remus, who had come in during this, sat down and looked at the letter. He read it carefully. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" "Reply," Harry said. "Acknowledge it. Leave the door open." He looked at Remus. "He knows things I need to know. About Voldemort, about the Order, about my parents. Closing the door doesn't help me. And the door being open doesn't mean he gets to walk through it whenever he wants," Sirius said. "Exactly." They sat with that for a moment. Then Remus said, in the voice he used when he was being carefully practical as a way of handling emotion, "The trial is in 2 weeks. If Pettigrew is found before then, Bones has the tracking report," Harry said. "She'll move on it." He looked at the Ragnarok report. "Southern England. That's a big area. Pettigrew was last, before everything, in the south," Sirius said. He was looking at the report with that directed flatness again, the anger that was contained rather than absent. He had a flat in Clapham. He wouldn't go back there. But he'd stay near familiar territory. He doesn't handle unfamiliarity well. Never did. He paused. He'd need to be near people he could feed from. A pet rat would. "Bones needs all of this," Harry said. "I told her all of this," Sirius said. 2 weeks ago. Tell her again. With the specific geography." Harry looked at him. "The trial is in 2 weeks. If he's found before then and we can actually produce him, the formal exoneration is complete, immediate, and uncontestable. Without him the forensic evidence is strong but it's still circumstantial." Sirius looked at him. "You want me to go with Bones? I want you to call her today and go wherever she needs you to go, yes. Harry, you know him better than any Auror. You know how he thinks." Harry met his eyes steadily. "This is not me sending you into something. This is me telling you that you have something no one else has and it matters." Sirius held his gaze for a moment. The gray eyes were sharp and present, no trace of the medical facility's dimness. He nodded once, decisively, and got up to use the flue. Bones arrived at Potter Manor the following morning at 8, which Harry suspected was the earliest she'd permit herself to intrude and possibly not as early as she'd wanted to come. She had a map with her, a team of 2 Aurors she introduced briefly, a solid, capable-looking woman named Shacklebolt and a younger man named Dawlish who had the eager quality of someone on his first significant case, and a specific, bright-eyed quality that Harry had learned to identify as Bones in active pursuit mode. They spread the map on the kitchen table over breakfast, which Tom had sent over in a care package the previous day. He sent one every week, apparently, on the grounds that growing boys needed feeding and Sirius was functionally a growing boy regardless of age, which was accurate. Sirius stood over the map with Bones and pointed, and talked, and Bones made marks, and Harry sat at the end of the table and watched and listened and asked one question and was answered directly and asked no more. At 10 they left, Bones, Sirius, Shacklebolt, Dawlish. Remus stayed at the table drinking tea with the expression of a man who was maintaining equilibrium through concentration. "Are you worried?" Harry asked. "Always," Remus said. "That's my natural state." He looked at Harry. "Are you?" Harry thought about it honestly. About Sirius being in physical danger from Peter Pettigrew, no. About the trial going wrong if they don't find him, a little. He paused. About what Sirius is going to feel when he actually finds him, yes. Remus put his cup down. He looked at Harry with those tired warm eyes and something moved in them that was not tiredness, the reverse of it, something alert and very present. "When did you get so old?" he said. "I was always like this," Harry said. "I just had more time than usual to develop it." Remus made a sound that was several things at once and picked his cup back up. Harry spent the morning in the library. He was working through the older texts now, the pre-ministry ones behind the glass panel, taking them carefully from the shelf and reading with the attention of someone who understood that these were not just books but the accumulated thought of people who were part of how he got here. One of them, a volume on ancient magical bloodlines and their properties, had a section on the Potter family that he read 3 times. It described, in the formal language of its period, a magical lineage with an unusually strong affinity for what it called responsive magic, magic that didn't just execute intention but adapted to circumstance. Not offensive, not defensive specifically. Responsive. The family magic knowing what was needed and providing it. The blood ward his mother had created, the most powerful protective magic anyone had apparently seen in a century, was the obvious example. But there were others in the family history. Spells that redirected rather than blocked. Enchantments that activated when needed rather than continuously. The clause itself, patient for 7 years, knowing when the moment was right. Responsive magic. Harry sat with that. He thought about the box opening under his thumb. The gate opening before he touched it. The house warming toward him on the drive. Not just inherited property recognizing its heir, something more active than that. Something that had been watching, through all the absence, and had been ready to move when he moved. He thought about what that meant for the magic he'd done without meaning to. The teacher's hair. The school roof. The thunderstorm smell. Not accidents. Responses. He got a fresh piece of paper and started writing. They came back at 6 in the evening. Harry heard the flow and was in the kitchen doorway when they came through, and he read the room in 1 second. Bones's face was controlled but bright in a specific way. Shacklebolt looked satisfied. Dawlish had the expression of someone who had participated in something significant and was still processing it, and Sirius was contained. Very deliberately contained, in the way of a man who had been through something large and had decided to be functional about it until he was somewhere private. Harry looked at Bones. "We found him," she said. The room was very quiet. He was, she paused, choosing words, in a residential property in Clapham. Living, as Sirius predicted, as a pet rat. In the home of a family who had no idea. She looked at Harry. "He's in ministry custody. He's been identified by animagus reversal. We used the standard Auror protocol, forced the transformation in custody. He is unambiguously Peter Pettigrew, and he is alive." "Veritaserum?" Harry asked. "Tomorrow. Standard procedure. He'll be questioned under Veritaserum in front of the Wisingdomot Inn." She checked her notes. "In an emergency session I've requested for the day after tomorrow." She looked at Sirius. "This is done." Sirius stood very still. "He'll confess to being the secret keeper," Harry said. "Under Veritaserum he has to." "Yes." "Which formally exonerates Sirius before the trial." "The trial becomes a formality, yes. The Veritaserum testimony overrides the need for the forensic case." Bones looked from Harry to Sirius. "It's over, Sirius." Sirius said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the kitchen table, the map still spread on it, the marks Bones had made that morning, the cups from breakfast. Then he looked up at Harry. "We got him," he said. His voice was rough. "Yeah," Harry said. Whatever the large thing was that Sirius had been containing, he let it go now, not loudly, not dramatically, just the particular stillness of someone releasing something they've been holding for a very long time. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the map and breathed, and Remus sat beside him and put a hand on his shoulder and said absolutely nothing, which was exactly right. Harry looked at Bones. She looked back with the expression she'd had in the family court when she'd asked him how he was, the not-quite softness. "You should know," she said quietly, stepping away from the table to the doorway where Harry stood, "that when we found him, when Sirius saw him, he could have done anything. Pettigrew was terrified, completely exposed, completely at Sirius's mercy." She paused. "He didn't touch him. He stood back and let us do our job. He said," she stopped briefly, "he said this one's for Harry." And he stepped back. Harry looked at Sirius at the table. At the set of his shoulders, the hands flat on the map. "Right," Harry said quietly. "He's a good man," Bones said. "I thought you should hear it from someone other than me or Remus." I already knew, Harry said. She nodded once, the nod of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. The Veritaserum session 2 days later was exactly what Bones had predicted, a formality with the particular flavor of the historically significant. Peter Pettigrew, small and grey and frightened, sat in the Wizengamot chambers and answered every question truthfully, and every answer built the same edifice. He had been the secret keeper, he had gone to Voldemort, he had fled after the explosion and lived as a rat for 7 years. Each answer in the precise, emptied voice of someone speaking without volition. Harry was not in the chamber. He had decided not to attend, which had surprised Bones slightly until he'd explained, he didn't need to see it. He needed it to happen, and it would happen without him. Being present was for people who needed closure in a particular form. He had other work to do. He spent the morning in the library. At noon Sirius came home and said, "Done," in a voice that had something new in it, not relief exactly, though that was part of it. Something more like completion. The feeling of a sentence that has been mid-air for 7 years finally reaching its full stop. He sat down in the kitchen and Harry made tea and they sat together in the afternoon light of the valley for a while without needing to fill it. Then Sirius said, "I want to talk about what comes next." "All right," Harry said. "The council session is in 3 weeks. Pettigrew's in custody. The formal exoneration will be issued within the week." He turned his cup in his hands. "Malfoy is going to know very soon, if he doesn't already, that the Order inquiry is back on the table. The inquiry closure that he voted for, with Pettigrew alive and testifying, the Wizengamot has grounds to reopen it." "I know," Harry said. "That investigation would look at the network of people who supported Voldemort. Who knew, who helped, who benefited from the inquiry being closed." He looked at Harry. "That's why Malfoy was nervous when you mentioned the records in the atrium." "He was nervous before I mentioned them," Harry said. "He saw you and calculated whether you were dangerous before he said hello. His expression when he looked at you lasted about half a second, but I saw it." He paused. "He didn't expect you to be functional this soon." Sirius made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's a somewhat low bar." He'd said it. On purpose. Harry looked at his tea. "He'll move before the council session. Something subtle, a question about the proxy registration, a challenge to the procedure, something designed to delay without appearing to delay. What do we do about it?" "We're already doing it," Harry said. "Ragnarok's been preparing the registration defense for 2 weeks. Bones has the Pettigrew testimony, which pulls the ground out from under anyone who doesn't want the inquiry reopened. And," he paused, then said the thing he'd been thinking about for 3 days, "I want to make a public statement. Before the council session." Sirius looked at him. "Not a press conference," Harry said quickly. "Not the Daily Prophet and not performing anything. I mean a formal statement to the Wizengamot. A written submission, for the record, under the Potter seal. About the past month. What happened, what was found, what it means." He looked at Sirius. "If I make the record before they can shape the narrative, it's harder to reshape it afterward." Sirius stared at him for a long moment. "Your father," he said, "used to say that the best time to own the story was before anyone else started telling it. Did it work for him?" "Usually." A pause. "He was 17 when he figured that out. You're 8. You keep, I know. Sirius set his cup down. "Write the statement. I'll have Ragnarok review it." He looked at Harry with those grey eyes that were properly warm now, had been for weeks, the candle and the storm lantern burning steadily, no longer in danger of going out. For what it's worth, he stopped, did the thing Remus always stopped himself doing, reaching for the sentence. "Finish it," Harry said. "You and Remus both. Please." Sirius looked at him. Something moved through his face, the grief and the warmth and the wider, harder to name thing, all of it present, none of it hidden. "He'd have been so proud of you," Sirius said. "Both of them." Lily would have picked apart your legal strategy and improved it in 3 places, and James would have been completely insufferable about the Malfoy thing in the atrium. He paused. He'd have told it at dinner every night for a year. Harry looked at his tea. His eyes felt warm, which was a different thing from crying and didn't require management, just acknowledgement. "Good," he said, when he trusted his voice. "I'll keep giving him material." Remus appeared in the doorway, from outside, coat on, mud on his shoes, the look of someone who'd been on a walk that had turned into a long walk. He took in the kitchen, the tea, the quality of the silence, the fact that Harry's eyes were slightly too bright. He sat down and poured himself a cup from the pot and said nothing, because Remus always knew when nothing was the right thing and when it wasn't, and this was a when it was. The 3 of them sat in the kitchen of Potter Manor while the afternoon deepened outside and the stream ran in the valley and the household charms held the warmth steady around them, patient and constant and entirely prepared to keep doing so. Harry wrote the statement that evening. He sat at the desk in the library, the reading table with the good lamp, the afternoon light replaced by the lamp's warm circle, and wrote in the careful, small handwriting that was his and no one else's, and he said what had happened plainly and completely and without embellishment. What had been found? What had been wrong? What had been corrected? What still needed addressing? He wrote about the clause and what it had been designed for and how long it had taken to activate. He wrote about the estate and its mismanagement. He wrote about Sirius, briefly and completely. He wrote about Pettigrew. He wrote about the inquiry that had been closed without proper investigation and the standing request, which he now formally submitted under the Potter seal, for its reopening. He did not write about the cupboard. That was in the record already, in a different kind of language, Bones's documentation, clinical and thorough. What Harry wrote was strategic rather than personal. The personal was already public. This was about the future. He wrote, near the end, "I am 8 years old. I have been a member of this world for less than a month. In that time I have found that it contains remarkable people doing important things with genuine care, Assessor Bones, Account Manager Ragnarok, and others, and I have also found that it contains the same tendency present in all human institutions to prioritize convenience over accountability, and comfort over truth. This statement is submitted as notice that the Potter family seat will be occupied at the next council session, and that the House of Potter intends to be a consistent presence in ensuring that accountability and truth are not optional." He put the quill down. He read it back. He added nothing and removed nothing. He folded it, sealed it with the Potter seal, amber wax, the P pressed in cleanly, and set it on the corner of the desk to go to the Wisengamot in the morning. Then he sat back in the library chair and looked at the shelves around him, 2,000 books, the family's accumulated thought, the deep old smell of paper and time, and felt the house settle around him, warm and constant, the way it had been settling every evening since the first night. Home. He'd read that word 100 times in the estate documents. In the clause, in the property records, in Ragnarok's formal language and his father's fast slanted notes. It had always been just a word, a category, a description. He'd had no reference for what it felt like to have one. He had one now. He turned off the lamp and went to bed, and outside in the valley the stream ran in the dark the way it always had, indifferent to the month's events, doing exactly what it had always done, and the hills folded around it as they'd always folded, and the house held its warmth, and in the morning there would be tea and Ragnarok's letters and Sirius reading the Prophet and Remus arguing about bookshelves and tutors arriving next week, and a council session in 3 weeks, and a world that was very large and full of things that needed looking at and people who were trying hard and systems that failed and beauty and difficulty and all of it was his to move through, to engage with, to push back against when it needed pushing. Harry Potter was 8 years old. He had a godfather and a family and a home and an estate and a family magic that was responsive and patient and prepared to meet him wherever he went. He was not afraid of anyone. And he was only just getting started. But the morning brought one more letter. It arrived with the dawn, not by owl but by a small silver charm, a Patronus messenger, which Harry would learn to recognize, in the shape of a cat, which sat on the windowsill of his bedroom and said in Bones's voice, precise and alert even at 6 in the morning, the Wisengamot has received your statement. There are already 3 objections filed. One is from Malfoy's office. One is procedural, probably planted. The third is from Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, who I suspect was woken by someone early this morning and is now deeply uncomfortable. A pause, and then something in Bones's voice shifted, not softness exactly, more like the controlled warmth of someone who respected what they were reporting. The Wisengamot Chief Warlock Ogden has issued a formal acknowledgement of the statement, which he is not required to do. He doesn't do it often. The session stands. The inquiry reopening motion will be on the docket. Another pause. Well done, Harry. The hard part starts now. The Patronus dissolved. Harry sat up in bed in the morning light of Potter Manor and looked at the empty windowsill, and thought about 3 objections and a minister who'd been woken before sunrise and a chief warlock who didn't acknowledge statements often. He thought about Malfoy's expression in the atrium. He thought about Dumbledore's letter and its architecture. He thought about all the things that needed proper investigation and all the people who had preferred them uninvestigated. He got up, got dressed, and went downstairs to make tea. Sirius was already there. He'd seen the Patronus, his bedroom window faced the same direction, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with the look of a man who had read the morning correctly. 3 objections, Harry said. Bones told me. She sent mine separately. Sirius looked at him. Fudge is going to be a problem. He was always going to be a problem, Harry said, and poured his tea. We'll deal with him properly. Sirius looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning light of the valley, and the grey eyes were warm and sharp and entirely present, and he said, Yeah. We will. Outside, the stream ran in the valley. The hills held the morning quiet. And somewhere in London, in offices and chambers and the careful architecture of institutions that had been running for centuries, people were adjusting their understanding of what the next few years were going to look like. Harry Potter had come home. Everything else would follow.